that and immediately said that he would stand behind him. Suddenly, Jin Woo saw that a lot of his soldiers had gathered in one place and were looking somewhere. He wondered what they were doing there. Suddenly, the dragons that were standing there started spewing flames straight up into the sky. Immediately after that, a shadow soldier holding a magic orb began to release a huge fire that tore apart the clouds and everything began to glow with bright red and yellow fire. The dragons standing near him watched in bewilderment as he did this. But our hero, who was looking at the fawn, didn't understand how this was possible. After all, he was using a fire sphere. At the same moment, he saw that the ants began to pull logs and large stones. He wondered what they were doing here. The Baryon commander-in-chief began to explain to our hero that they were setting up his temporary home, and wanted the Lord to be comfortable here. Baryon also asked why he wasn't sending the soldiers back in the day. Answered that they would be cramped there, as they were all trapped by the interdimensional hole themselves. The hero then decided to ask Baryon about being with Osborne no longer and if he missed him. Baryon replied that he had supported him even when the rulers decided to go to war against the Absolute Being, and he had been his first warrior when he had gotten the power of the dead. It seemed like an eternity to him since then, but he never questioned his decisions. Our hero was curious to hear the Baryon story. He began to tell that he was born from the fruit of the world tree, which is how all the celestial wars were born. The tree was so huge that the sky itself disappeared with its branches. He went farther and farther with his master Jin Woo and told him his story. Note the punctuation and spelling. The changes made should correct the errors in the text. The next day, Jin Woo pondered about the need to warn people in advance about the coming battle with the monsters and the fact that a real war would soon break out here. He's afraid that it won't be possible to save everyone, and moreover, he's not sure if the world can go back to normal after everything. From his memories of Osborne, the Dragon Lord, he was very powerful. Now that the Dragon Lord and his army of destruction have converted everything in their path, their target is the Earth. Therefore, this battle would not only affect him, but all of humanity as well. When Jin Woo bent down to open the refrigerator and grab some groceries from there, his mother came up to him and asked if he was okay. He wondered why she was asking, and she started to say that his father, before leaving on a dangerous mission, always cooked for her. It's already clear without a test here that he's his son and they look so much alike. But Jin Woo started telling her not to worry, for everything is fine. Suddenly they heard someone knocking on the door. Jin Woo began to walk towards it, and as soon as he got to the door and opened it, he immediately asked how he could help them. But the man who came to them turned out to be Jin Ho's father. He started apologizing for them coming unannounced and asking if Jin Woo could spare him some time. After a while, they were walking through the park, and Jin Ho's father began to tell them that he had originally thought that the sleeping sickness had gone away on its own due to a happy coincidence. However, such things don't just happen, and only he and his mother were able to pull themselves out of the eternal sleep sickness. Therefore, he immediately thought of Jin Woo, and he wondered why the hunter had helped him, to which our hero replied, because he decided he could be trusted and the end justifies the means. And if he really did, there's no way he would have gone to such lengths for him. And suddenly the man realized that he was talking about his son Jin Ho, and he had done that because he refused to use his son. Only they didn't stop. That man didn't even know how to thank Jin Woo and started saying that he could at least give half the fee or a quarter and repay him for saving him, or maybe he wishes for something. To which Jin Woo started to say that he doesn't want anything except if something happens to him suddenly, can he take care of his family? That's all he wants. A little while later, our hero was sitting in the office of the chairman of the Hunters Association. He began to show him pictures from Shanghai and said that there were only 8 such gates in the world and practically at the same time. The chairman decided to ask for what, and our hero answered that, unfortunately, no. And as soon as he stood up, he decided to ask the chairman if he believed him, to which the chairman replied that he certainly did. Then our hero decided to show him something. And as soon as he touched his forefinger to his forehead, he began to see everything that our hero saw when he met the Lord of Shadows. And as soon as he took his finger, the chairman jumped up and started shouting that it couldn't be and how this was even possible, because he always believed that this power was created by the gods to protect people. That was why hunters fought against monsters. But if what he showed him was true, then he was too arrogant and they were all deluded. And the hunters, or rather the awakened ones, they were made to survive this war, a war between rulers and monarchs, the two strongest sides of light and darkness. And the chairman couldn't believe that Jin Woo would fight him and alone. And the chairman wondered how he could help him, and the next day, many people began to gather. The chairman asked his mentee if anyone else should come, to which he started to say no, because according to the approved guest list, only 152 countries were here. This was a guy, wondering what Hunter Jinwoo said to him, and after all, he had never seen the chairman so pale before. But the chairman replied that everything was fine, but the fact that there was an army of dragons bursting through the darkness, and behind it majestically walked the most enormous among them, so beastly was he that it seemed no hunter could resist him. With a lanky aura of all-consuming fear, this creature could burn everything to the ground with one breath. That was what he saw. He wondered how Hunter Jinwoo was going to fight them alone, and the chairman started calling our hero and saying that he had gathered everyone at his request. And he was wondering where he was. Our hero was already appearing behind him, right out of the shadows, and saying that he had just about arrived. And the chairman realized that he shouldn't have asked about his whereabouts, and he started to tell Jinwoo that when they made the truth public, there would be total chaos in the world and not every country could quell the human unrest. But our hero knew this, because today in this place the whole world will learn the truth about the coming war. There were a lot of people gathered, presidents of countries, ministers, heads of guilds and associations of hunters, and all the attention was focused on the Hunter Jinwoo. He started to say that it would be great to say that this gate would also be closed without much trouble. But hearing that the opposite was true, it would be a difficult time for all of us, and no one would be able to escape the upcoming battle, as these creatures would appear right in front of them and destroy everything they hold dear. However, some referees started shouting from the audience, claiming that why should they believe him? After all, it's not like he's trying to say that even national-level hunters wouldn't be able to handle them. Our hero starts telling them that there are hundreds of monsters to come, each of which will be stronger than the Reed, who once already almost wiped mankind off the face of the earth. And he assures that even national-level hunters won't be able to handle it. All the gathered people needed proof, so they started to ask the Hunter Jinwoo to show them why they can trust him and believe in what he claims, that there is a creature scarier than the Reed, and even in such numbers. But suddenly, our hero raised his hand, and many gates appeared behind his back. Everyone in the building saw the gate that the hunter had opened in front of them, and there were so many of them. Jinwoo started to say that the enemy was also able to open gates wherever and whenever he wanted, but his army was so huge that it gave them some kind of head start. But suddenly, some man from the audience started shouting, "Is he really one of them, and the monsters from the first giant gate, weren't they summoned here to kill us all?" He trusts the hunter, of course, but still, the other man also started to say that they realized that it was possible to get out of these gates, and asked how they should go about it. Jinwoo told him that the most important thing was to get as far away from the enemy as possible and run as far away as possible. After all, the excitement of humanity from the information told to his wife was overwhelming. After learning of monsters that no living thing could handle, people evacuated from the gate in fear. And in that lonely place where our hunter's entire army was, he stood looking at his castle, which was so large that he could never have imagined such a thing. As soon as he saw it, he immediately told his shadow soldier Baru to come close to him and bang his head on the ground. And he started telling him that this was the little cozy place where you could live comfortably. Okay, its size is small, but what he calls it is a simple dwelling. To which BR started to cowardly and said that this is the place that corresponds to his king. And Jinwoo was wondering, why the hell did they hang that flag on top of the castle? Suddenly, he heard someone else behind him slam his head on the ground. It was Barayan who had this idea, and Jinwoo immediately asked Barayan, what happens to the army if the commander-in-chief goes missing? If he dies, will he be able to take over the army under his leadership? To which Barayan began to say that their existence was tied to the life of the ruler, and if his eyes closed, they would all return to him. Our hero began to realize that the power of the Shadow Army lies in its loyalty. After all, it follows its master everywhere, and that is also its weakness. There is no way enemies will bite at this opportunity. And Barayan began to tell his ruler that there was no chance of victory in such a war, and our hero decided to ask him what he thought the difference in strength would be. To which Barayan began to say that he thought it was somewhere around 100 times. And it turns out that he meant to say that the enemies will have about 10 million warriors. The next day, the top-level hunter, J. Mills, was talking about TV, telling it to shove that nonsense up its ass. If he had Hunter Jinwoo's contacts, he would have told him that personally, but the reporter who was doing the interview started telling him that still Jinwoo is one of the best hunters in the world. If he thinks that his warning shouldn't be ignored, he is wrong. But that hunter started to reply that no matter how great a man he might be, it doesn't mean that all his words are true. And whatever heresy he may be saying, you can't just appropriate all the gates so easily. The chairman who was showing our hero the tape began to say that people were gathering around the Canadian hunter, and it seemed that countries with strong hunter systems, such as India, were also gathering for their own personal raids. He decided to ask what he planned to do, and our hero began to answer that he would go to China first, for he would not be able to hold back 8 armies at once, and so he must first get rid of Korea, where his family is, and leave the other tasks for later. After all, the longer the war lasts, the better his chances will be. And the very next day, Jin Woo was getting off the airplane and immediately started saying that he heard that the bureaucrats were coming to meet him, but suddenly he didn't expect to meet the hunter Lu Jigang here. Jigang started to say that these idiots had already started making some plans, but he decided to bring him up to speed personally and started showing him the gate that was visible from the airport itself. It was the same supermassive gate that had opened recently. Suddenly Jigang pointed out that there were over 100,000 elite Chinese hunters standing there. If they have that many hunters, they are not just that many, because each of them has outstanding skills that they are willing to use to the maximum. At the same moment, Jin Woo began to summon his shadow army, which began to appear everywhere, on rooftops and all around. Jigang realized that the difference was huge, and such beings were coming down from the heavens to here, which was unbelievable to him, because he couldn't imagine that they were his summoned soldiers. But suddenly, the shadowy Commander BR appeared and started saying that the seat to the left of the center was his, and how dare he stand beside the Lord. However, Jin Woo elbowed him in the stomach and told him that he was Jin Woo, and to shut up, because the Lord standing next to him was his ally. Jigang couldn't believe that he could even talk to his shadow soldiers. At that moment, the gate began to open, and that's when our hero realized that it had all begun. But the variant that was standing to his right started saying that it was somehow strange, because he couldn't feel any energy, and it was the same in the rest of the locations. These soldiers began to transmit that in other locations the same situation, and it turned out that all the gates were empty. At this point our hero turned around and realized that he was wrong, because he thought that the monarchs had done this on purpose to divide his army, but they had deliberately concentrated all their forces in the farthest location where the group of hunters were now. They were standing in front of this gate from which those creatures that would be able to destroy the entire world were about to emerge. The leaders of those hunters who were standing in front of the gate from which those monsters were going to come out began to remember the news headlines where they saw that Jin Woo's hunter had traveled to China, and Japan and Ukraine had decided to support Jin Woo. The planes with the hunters are scheduled to leave this afternoon. Turns out the White Fortress found in the forests of Japan has nothing to do with the gate. With 5 hours to go before the opening, the enemy would find out if Hunter Jin Woo's warning was true. While everyone only hoped for Jin Woo, those hunters who were standing in front of the gate didn't even flinch. After all, they didn't want to abandon Canada, and those hunters who were left behind had to protect their lives and their homeland, and whoever came out of there, they would win. That was what they thought. Along came the hunters who were standing in front of the gate. They realized that it was already starting. And suddenly they saw that one man started to appear from the gate. Jin Woo was lying after all. From afar, they saw an ordinary man who began to descend to the ground and appeared in front of the hunter who stood at the head of all the others. That man who came out of the gate began to ask if he was the one who called himself the king of this place. Suddenly, although someone didn't understand that this wasn't the language of monsters, but the hunter who was standing next to the leader began to tell him that there was nothing to be surprised about, because monsters can create and wear armor, and they can also have organized systems. In other words, they may have intelligence equal to humans, and it's just that they haven't tried to connect with them before. But there's nothing wrong with monsters learning their language to commiserate with them. After all, humans and monsters can communicate. And that was to the liking of the leader who stood in front of the man who appeared from the gate. The leader of the Canadian hunters realized that he was right after all and began to understand how Jin Woo was able to get hold of those creatures from the first gate. After all, they were communicating. Did that mean that if he answered his question with a yes, he would immediately become his subordinate? Suddenly the leader answered that he was the king of this place, and that monarch who appeared from the gate realized that the Lord of Darkness was not here. But at this time our hero started asking if they had a way to know the state of the gate in Canada, and no one but Adam White would be able to tell for sure. All of a sudden our hero gets his phone deleted, and he started talking to him and asking, "What's the status of the gate in Canada?" Adam started to say that he was currently with the rest of the agents assisting near the gate, but our hero was wondering why he was there and what he was there for. Adam started to say that he was in no position to just sit back and observe the situation, because not only him, but the other agents were now gathered here. Jin Woo began to realize that this was all because he still didn't know the size of the enemy army, and he began to ask Adam of his brother would show, nothing appeared. To which Adam replied that it seems to be as quiet as anywhere else. Everything is quiet. And all could calm down, Jinwoo, but suddenly he started to say that something strange was happening now. And there was a man standing in front of him. He was wondering where this stranger came from, but our hero realized who it was and started to insist that he should run away as fast as possible and leave this place immediately. But when Adam looked towards the gate, he saw that the hunters who were standing there had turned to ashes. Our hero, Jinwoo, kept yelling into his pipe to just run away, for he had to leave as soon as possible. And then Adam started talking about how there were dragons in the sky and there were hundreds of them, and they all came out of nowhere. And all the monsters were all mixed together. He couldn't believe how that was possible. But Jinwoo realized that he could save at least Adam, and he started to use his shadow that was always by his side. And a huge orc appeared near Adam and started saying that he would send him to his lord. But suddenly the monarch appeared and started talking to Adam about where he was going to go. And at that very second, the monarch began to open his mouth, and flames began to emerge from it. And in an instant he spewed fierce flames towards Adam. Our hero realized that something terrible had happened, and he should have seen it coming. If the shadow soldiers are only getting stronger with each battle, the enemies probably know this and will just attack all together at one point. They decided to open 8 portals, creating the illusion as if they were preparing to enter each one individually, but they ended up focusing on Tom, who was farthest away from them. This turned out to be a mistake, since if they continued like this, they would only start a one-sided war. Jinwoo realized that his plan had failed, and he began to wonder if there was anything he could do. That monarch who stood in Canada began to say to himself, "I will not burn those who are still alive and listen to their death cries. The sounds of all living things are beautiful, and I do not want them to soon disappear from the face of the earth." As soon as he moved to another location, he realized that the other side was also ready for battle. He ordered all his dragons to destroy everything, as this was their only mission. At this moment, the President of the United States Association was sitting in his office watching the broadcast where everything alive was being incinerated. He had already drank quite a bit of alcohol and realized that everyone was already dead, the hunters, the agents, the journalists filming it all, and even the hundreds of dragons. Behind them were giant beasts and a huge insect, and it was impossible for a human to withstand such a catastrophe. He thought everyone was dead, and began to tell himself that it was only a matter of time before they reached the US. Now he understood why Hunter Jinwoo had so clearly assured him to run as far away as possible and that the world was over and everything was over. But suddenly, in the same room, he saw a shadow of some sort begin to appear, and after a few seconds, he recognized Hunter Jinwoo, who appeared and began to say that he was looking for something and had come uninvited because he wanted the rune stone. The president of the association should give him the stone left behind by Reed. But the president of the association started to say that he knows that the stone belongs to their hunter's bureau, but suddenly he realized that he was talking nonsense. It was his working habit. What bureau of hunters? What is he talking about? America will be destroyed soon, not some bureau. Why would he care about some rune stone? As soon as he realized this, he apologized to the hunter and began to say that he was still sober and he could give the stone, but he wondered why the hunter Jinwoo wanted it. To which the hunter replied that he would use it, so they soon started to go down the lower floors to the warehouse where that stone was stored. The president of the association started to say that the monsters were sent to Earth by beings called monarchs. He wondered what those rune stones in their bodies were, and Jinwoo explained that they helped humans hunt monsters better. The monarchs wanted magic to take root in the land through skirmishes with monsters and human sacrifices are just a side effect, not their main goal. The stone is a repository of the monster's power after it dies. It's kind of a show of care on the part of the monarchs helping humans hunt monsters. The president wondered if he could definitely deal with monsters using this stone, but Jinwoo told him that he would still give it a try, and he had one more request. Shortly after he took the stone, he met Miss Selner, who was sitting in her house, and began to say that she didn't think anyone would be looking for her at a time like this. As soon as she saw Jinwoo, she realized that he was not the man she knew him to be. The darkness used to hide deep inside him, but now he was the darkness itself. Jinwoo began to say that he was still the person she knew, just a Tatma. What she had seen in the past had become one with him. Jinwoo began to ask what she was saying, that she could see the future and if she could look into his future so he could find out what would be there. Mrs. Selner thought about it for a moment and agreed after all. Taking our hero by the hand, after a moment she had tears on her face and asked Jinwoo if he was really going to do everything alone. After all, she didn't understand how it was even possible that one person could shoulder such a burden. He had decided to sacrifice one to save everyone, and Mrs. Sellner realized that, thankfully, it looked like he would be able to go that far after all. But Mrs. Sellner started to say that no one would even be able to remember it all, and he would have to fight a lonely battle. After all that was said, Jinwoo got up and started saying that he apologized for coming so suddenly. He then asked for her service and informed her that he had to leave. As soon as the shadow appeared, Jinwoo traveled to another time, to the tallest tower. When he found himself there, he took his phone out of his pocket and called Hunter Cha. He told her that he was a bit busy, but she was also up to her neck in business and didn't have a chance to even see him. However, she still wanted to see Jinwoo at least once and asked him to promise that he would come and see her. He agreed and assured her that he would definitely come. As soon as he hung up the phone, the head of the guild approached the huntress and told her that it was time for them to move out, as the very thing that would lead them to the endless war in this world was about to begin. The Eurasian Hunters Federation, the Hunters Association of Europe, the African Hunters Emergency Association, and the United States Hunters Emergency Association, altogether hundreds of thousands of hunters, were heading to the battlefield. That monarch, who was standing near the slain hunters, began to say that he was here, and looked up into the sky. At the same time, on the other side of the planet, our hero was standing on a high tower and heard his voice saying that already millions of his companions were dead. How much longer would he be in hiding? To which Jinwoo told him to wait a little longer and they would see each other soon. The next day, the monarch stood on the ruined building and realized that something was too quiet near him. He wondered what the Smoke Lord of Shadows was up to. Although he wasn't surprised that he had escaped into the abyss, after all, his army had over 10 million soldiers while he only had 100,000. Going against them with such a number was tantamount to suicide. But suddenly a missile flew into the monarch's face and began to collapse, followed by many more missiles that began to explode near him. The fighters that were hovering in the air began to say that the goal had been achieved, but from above they couldn't see if they had killed Leonidas Ramonster, and they hoped that this time they had succeeded. But suddenly, after the fire began to reach the sky, one of the pilots saw a large eye that was near him, and he did not realize what it was. For they all saw a huge smoke in which two big and scary eyes were visible. He was very bored, and at that very second he started destroying all the fighters that were hovering in the air. While Monarch was playing with the birds that were flying in the air, Jinwoo was in his castle on a deserted island and was sitting on his throne. He was too pensive, for he did not know what was going to happen next. But as soon as he started to lift his head up, he saw that above his throne was written "My King," and he smiled because of it, for his commander Bar had done it. As his shadow soldiers began to appear, Jinwoo knew what he had to do next. Barayan, who appeared on the side of the Lord's right hand, began to say that it was too dangerous. And Akris, who appeared on his left side, agreed with him, but Jinwoo realized that they were all worried about him. However, he can't sit idly by, and even if the danger is too great. Not this time, and the previous Shadow Lord said that this was the reason why he chose him. So he began to turn to Barayan, asking what he would do if Osborne was in the exact same situation. Barayan began to say that there was no way he would have given up. And our hero smiled after those words, and there was a look of surprise behind it. He looked at his lord and began to realize that he was the same as the previous Shadow Lord. Immediately after that, a decision was made and all of his shadow commanders bowed their heads and began to say that they would follow him until the very end. As soon as Jinwoo heard that, he stood up, and you along with him. And as soon as he pulled out his phone, Barayan asked if he would call his family at a time like this, to which our hero replied that he was afraid to hear their voices and it would prevent him from moving on. At that very second, he cracked his phone open and was ready to go to the very spot where his opponent was waiting for him. There was only one of the dragons left here now, flying behind one of the fighters out of that entire dozen. Still, the dragon was much faster, and eventually it caught up to that fighter and blew it up. But the soldier who was flying it was able to eject in time. As soon as his parachute opened, he started to descend to the ground and found himself near one of the broken buildings. He didn't stand still, and at that very second he hid behind a corner, seeing his comrades being devoured by the terrifying monsters nearby. Suddenly, goosebumps ran through his body and he saw some slime drop on his shoulder. When he turned around, he saw a huge centipede in front of him that was staring right at his face, and at that very second, it started to attack him. However, he jumped aside in time and grabbed his automatic rifle and started shooting at the centipede. He hoped that he would be able to destroy it, but the gun ran out of ammunition and he realized that this was his end and he was going to die. He barred his eyes, but as soon as he opened them, he saw that the monster that was attacking him had been torn apart. At first he didn't realize what had happened, for it was all done in a second. And as soon as he looked behind that slain monster, he saw the hunter Jinwoo, who was standing as if he was Jesus. Immediately, Jinwoo turned around and told that soldier to hurry up and leave, but the soldier didn't understand, for he was still in a state of concussion. But as soon as he saw the terrifying monsters coming towards him, he started screaming. At that very second, Jinwoo began to use the ruler's touch and a power that was created from darkness appeared in his right blade. And as soon as he swung, all the monsters that were running at him were destroyed. The hunter realized that this would be the start of the war, and all of his shadow soldiers started to appear at that second. At the same moment, the monarch realized that the Shadow Lord had appeared on the eastern front, and the monster that was near him began to speak to the monarch. "Why don't I move all their forces there too?" To which another monarch started to say that his shadow had no army, so now it was best for them to disperse their forces. He was going to single-handedly defeat all the monsters and turn them into his puppets afterward. It looked like this person had decided to start small instead of going for a meadow attack, and the monarch was wondering what the Shadow Lord was up to after all. At the moment, the head of the association was watching a live report from the place where they reported that communication with the hunters who had been sent to fight the monsters had been lost. America had urgently mobilized the armed forces to buy time to evacuate many of the population. He realized that the tragedy that unfolded on the other side of the world, first in Canada and now in America, which was famous for its incredible fighting power, was being destroyed literally before his eyes. And now humanity was left with only one hope, and he prayed that it would not leave them. Hundreds of soldiers were joining the ranks of the Dark Army every second, like a tsunami that swallowed everything around it, and the Shadow Wars were rapidly filling the battlefield, painting it in deep black colors. Hunter Jinwoo's last hope was to fight with all his might against the monsters that appeared in his path. Those giants that were taller than skyscrapers and lay down several neighborhoods with a single blow were in front of him. With lightning speed, he headed towards them and slashed their legs. Soon after, the shadow soldiers would finish off these monsters by attacking them like locusts. Thus, he was turning the slain monsters into his army. However, when he raised his head, he saw that there were a great many dragons flying at him. At this moment, he should not have despaired, for if he did not want to act, he would have to be forced to do so right now. Jinwoo decided to summon his entire 100,000 army. And as soon as those dragons that were in the air saw this, they started spewing horrible flames towards the shadow soldiers. And the dragon that was floating in the air began to say that he wanted to destroy the Dragon King. However, by doing so, he would only make them laugh, and Jinwoo was not standing still. At this time, he was already on the dark dragon and started telling him that he was talking a lot. And as soon as he jumped off his dragon, he hit that talking dragon with full force, dealing damage to it, causing it to start falling to the ground. The Dragon King realized that he was getting stronger each time, and he realized that it was time to move out. He ordered the Transfiguration Lord to stay here and prepare for the attack. The Dragon King didn't want to let the King of Darkness win, and even the ordinary soldiers who were on the ground fought. They saw the terrifying monsters in front of them, but they spared no ammunition and fired. The more the better, because if they hit the appearance of the enemies, they would at least slow them down and they would by no means wait for the hunters to come and save them. And just as one of the monsters began to approach the regular soldiers, Thomas Andre appeared and with one blow sent the large monster back where it came from. He was glad that he had not seen such monsters for a long time, because just recently they were only found in dungeons, and the scavengers were ready to fight, although Thomas Andre realized that there were a lot of them. But that was all right. But at the same moment someone else appeared, emerging from the shadows of the monsters, and began to tell Thomas Andre that this was the same vessel that had lost to the Beast Lords, and he was the Steel Body Lord, monarch of the monstrous humanoids. In a split second his life could be cut short by his fault, and he asked Thomas, he still wanted to fight. But Thomas didn't understand what he was saying, for he didn't care at all, for it was not his style to think long. And at that moment a huge shadow appeared behind Thomas, from which the shadow soldiers started to come out, and the first one who came out was the Baron Commander-in-Chief, and began to tell the monarch of the humanoids that they had not seen each other for a long time. But the monarch of the humanoids did not understand where the shadow army came from, and did he really say that they were hiding in the shadow of an ordinary man? It was unbelievable, and he decided to quickly report it to the Dragon King. But suddenly he realized that his communication channel was blocked. This was because she had turned her attention to the nearest building that the Shadowfang soldier was standing on, and he used his magic to block all the communications that were in his sight. The humanoid monarch didn't realize that the Shadow Lord and his soldiers, and it was unlikely that they would have thought of such a thing. A shadow army would never do such a thing. After all, it was more like the methods of humans, and the humanoid monarch began to get angry and shouted that he was not worthy of carrying the title of Lord. But the commander didn't agree with this and began to tell him to take it back immediately, otherwise he might be greatly regretted for insulting his king. These words hurt the humanoid monarch very much, and he began to shout that some pathetic soldier was standing in the monarch's way. In an instant, he turned into a huge humanoid that was ready to demolish everything in his way. And at this time, Jean had already met the Dragon King and was ready for that battle that would put an end to all this torment. Maybe regretted a lot. And as Jinwoo came closer and closer to the Dragon King stood there not understanding. After all, he thought that the Steel Body Lord wasn't answering him because he had betrayed him, or was this just another ploy by Hunter Jinwoo? But he didn't want to ponder any longer, and at this very second, he and his companion's flames began to appear. He decided to finish off Jinwoo right away, and huge flames flew at our hero. But our hero stood there and didn't move, and at one moment, when the flames died down, in front of the Dragon King it was seen that his flames had wiped out literally several kilometers, and all the houses that were in the area were burned to the ground. But that was just the beginning, for our hero was alive, and he was now on his dragon, which was flying above the Dragon King, and Jinwoo sprang into action, summoning his army of shadow soldiers. In the same second, they began to fall straight towards the Dragon King. But the latter, in turn, began to raise his hand, from which passers began to appear. And with that he wanted to destroy them. But now we are shown that the Hunter Jigon was fighting against a huge monster. And as soon as he killed the huge giant, he realized that it was much easier for him to fight them than when he was at sea. And he began to feel faint fluctuations of magical energy everywhere. Hundreds of thousands of hunters were now fighting against countless monsters. And in that side, it was like an epicenter of pain. If he went closer there, he would immediately be swallowed up by the hell wave of pain and suffering. Jigon realized that Jinwoo had started to act after all, and he was fighting against the Dragon King with the help of his shadow soldiers. But the Dragon King was very strong, and with one wave of his hand, he destroyed all the shadow soldiers that Jinwoo released. And it was very little to him, for he didn't think that Jinwoo had unleashed his entire army. After all, it was only a bunch of pitiful warriors. And the Dragon King started to say that if he thought he could be handled with such a number, it was too arrogant of him. But suddenly, the Dragon King started to see that the Hunter Jinwoo started to run away into the portal. But the Dragon King didn't want to just let him go like that and didn't let him escape and leave. With great speed he rushed after him. As soon as they both passed, the Dragon King saw a huge army of shadow soldiers in front of him, already standing and waiting for them. And then he realized that he had already absorbed the warriors of the humanoid lords. So while they were having fun with him, his puppets had quietly infected his comrade. The Dragon King thought that this was not a bad plan. However, he knew that this could happen, and the Transfiguration Lord who stood on one edition began to open many gates. The Dragon King began to say that it seemed like Jinwoo had counted on him being the only one to fight him. However, he is in a hurry to disappoint him. If he looked up, he would see the portal that the Transfiguration Lord had prepared for the Dragon King. With this portal, he would be able to summon as many warriors as he wanted. He started to say that Jinwoo's plan was doomed to fail and he had lost. And now only death awaited him. But Jinwoo smiled and began to cancel his summoning. It became unclear to the Dragon King why he was letting his warriors go. Don't be afraid, I surrender already. Although there is an overwhelming might ahead, anyone in his place would have done the same. After all, a lot of dragons were flying towards Jinwoo, but he wasn't afraid in the slightest. After all, he was ready for it, thought the Dragon King. And he began to close his eyes, and some strange energy began to appear in his eyes. In that very second, the Dragon Password guessed what he was going to do. After all, among all the skills that can be obtained thanks to the Reed Rune Stone, there is the most ferocious one. This skill puts everyone into deep despair, regardless of whether it's friend or foe. And here, even Dragon Terror will not help. And thus all the dragons who were in the sky and all the monarchs who were on the ground began to feel a terrifying pain. The Dragon King, who was watching all this, did not understand why it increased. He thought that it only affects dragons. And at that very second, Jinwoo appeared, holding the Dragon Lord's hand, and began to say that he was about to go with him. the Dragon King realized that he had planned everything just for this. And in that very second, they started to appear in a different place, that deserted island where Jinwoo's castle was. The Dragon King couldn't understand where they appeared, but Jinwoo started saying that they were now on the other side of the world. The Dragon King began to say that if he had as many warriors as they were there, he could easily defeat them. However, his mana reserves were not limitless, and he had done the right thing by bringing only him here. But suddenly, the dragon noticed the castle in front of him and asked whose castle it was. To which Jinwoo replied that it was his castle. The look on Jinwoo's face was funny when the Dragon King said that it was somehow small for a Shadow Lord's castle. At this moment, Jinwoo still decided that its size should be enough to celebrate the death of the Dragon King. But the smile that appeared on the Dragon King's face was incomprehensible, and he began to say that he would see how much would be enough while his wars were looking for him. In an instant, the Dragon King began to turn into a huge monster, and he was so big that the castle was like an ordinary car in comparison. But our hero before him was already prepared for this battle and had already managed to summon his shadowy commanders and commanders-in-chief. Mrs. Selner, who was in the same edition, was looking out the window and began to tell that man to look, that all of America was drowning in bright flames and the waves of magical energy were not fading. The chairman of the Bureau, 8, could not come to terms with what he had recently learned. After all, if what Hunter Jinwoo said was true, then he has no idea what they are going to do. And he wasn't the only one, for there were hunters from all over the world with him. No matter what rank they are, ranked ones are only slightly different from ordinary people. Compared to military men, they can wear armor and weapons from tempered with magical energy. However, each of them is well aware that this is just a drop in the ocean. With and without are vastly different. While one can only slay one monster, the other ranks can slay 3 at once, and with ranks can slay 10. But even that won't be enough. The same goes for the C-ranked. Together, they are capable of destroying thousands of monsters. However, even the highly ranked ones are not immune to death. And one day, each of them will become part of the vast firmament that will shine pyramids of stars to them. And one will follow the other, one soul will drift away to the heavens, followed by a ray of light in pitch darkness. What a rhythm their journey is, full of pain and despair. For this is how hope is born, and the president of the Hunters Association of Japan at this time began to report that the hunter Jinwoo had managed to capture the enemy leader, and they traveled together to the uninhabited Japanese islands. But the president of the association knew that Jinwoo had mentioned this somewhere a few kilometers away from Japan was an uninhabited island, overflowing with magical energy. If that was indeed the place he thought, then it was possible that the war could end with minimal casualties. Apparently, that's why he was hiding there. And the subordinate started asking the president of the association if he would order a gathering of hunters, to which the president started to reply. What about them? Would he want them from the rank and file or the national level? I mean, they have everything in America now, or should they send more rank and file over there? He asked his assistant what he thought, and the president of the association started telling him that because he didn't even know that once upon a time Hunter Jinwoo was also still orange. So even such low-ranked hunters could become heroes who were now fighting against a huge dragon and together with their shadow soldiers. Jinwoo began to attack the Dragon King, thus binding his huge clan so that he couldn't spew his horrible flames. And the large giants that were in Jinwoo's subordinate fell the Dragon King to the ground and began to restrain him. His subordinate Supreme Orgma began to use his magical power and pressed the Dragon King even harder to the ground. He was chained to the ground. The two commanders-in-chief leaped into the sky and began to attack the Dragon King with tremendous power and speed. Igris, who appeared in the sky, drew his sword and started attacking him with lightning. Jinwoo, who was watching all this, realized that everything was now going according to plan. But suddenly the Dragon King started laughing and said that it looked very funny, because he loves to overwhelm his opponent with numbers, but he didn't know that one day this trick would work on him. And damn, it was a lot of fun for him, but he decided it was time to do the honors and he was getting a little carried away. The Dragon King jumped up and started performing Dragon Terror. Darker Shadow, the soldiers who were on this island fell under his influence. After all, this dragon control technique had subdued Jinwoo as soon as it sounded, and he could no longer control his soldiers, so he began to cancel the summoning. But as soon as he started to do so, the Dragon King opened its huge mouth and started spewing out a terrifying power in the form of fire. The huge flames flew towards our hero, who was very close, and the Dragon King told him to return, calling him to repent. As the terrifying sphere of fire flew away and exploded into the sea, the Dragon King stood looking at the burned island. He spoke words of reality, blood, screams, madness and fear all merged together. The creatures that lived only amongst the moonlight and were willing to die for it were the true embodiment of destruction. He, the Dragon King, the monarch of destruction, Antares and Jinwoo, who was on Earth, realized that even magic in these lands after the death of the King of Giants was of no help. His immortal wars would instantly disappear before his fiery breath. And at the same moment, the Dragon King transformed back into a human and began to descend to the ground. "Speak, Jinwoo, so he can relax, for I have no intention of killing him yet," he said, impressed by how far Jin was able to get away from his pursuit. Though he could foil his plan at any moment, he wanted to have a conversation with him now. "You government and Osborne have already betrayed your memories," the king continued. "But I warn you, their location is not here, but on the other side of this world, and the ruler's army is who you must pursue. An absolute being has ordered them to destroy the monarchs, and the Shadow Lord is going to help them. I'd like to finish him off first, and then deal with the rulers." However, after seeing Jin fight, the king changed his mind. He realized that Jin is nothing like the past Shadow Lord, and in this he sees a chance to defeat the ruler's army. The Dragon King offers Jin, "If you want your family saved, that's not a question, I'll help. And if you want your country saved, I'll support you. But if you want me to leave this world, just ask and I will gather my warriors and leave this place forever. You will be the master of this world, and no one will even say a word to you." But the Dragon King held out his hand and began to say that first of all he would like him to shake that hand and they would work together to defeat the ruler's army. Then his family, no, all the people of Earth, could have peace. And the Dragon King asked, does he agree to such a tempting offer? But Jinwoo answered him not to make him laugh, for he really thinks he's just a confident freak who longs to destroy him. After all, he has it written all over his face. After the Dragon King heard that, he started laughing and said that it was a great pity. And that was his final mercy, and now the Shadow Lord can prepare for his death. At the same moment they started fighting again, and the Dragon King used his ability, enlarging his left hand to the size of a large dragon paw, which carried towards our hero. But Jinwoo was able to dodge it by leaping into the air, and in that same second he summoned his dragon, barring it from attacking, and flew even higher. Then the Dragon King transformed back into a huge dragon, which started spewing its flames from its big mouth towards Jinwoo. However, it was a miss, because Jinwoo ordered his Kaisel to drop down, and they began to fly around the Dragon King from the side. As he flew even closer, he spun with such speed that his blades that he had in his hands began to slice through the Dragon King's neck. After that, he jumped again and flew. But soon he realized that even they, the dragons, didn't even leave a scratch on him. The Dragon King and Jinwoo decided to fly a little farther away. He sensed that the Dragon King would attack with dragon terror again, and at that very second, castle started to burn with horrible flames. But he reacted in time, grabbed his master by the tail and threw him back. Jinwoo realized that he had saved his life by doing so, for he had thrown him aside and was flying onward. And by doing so, he took on the fire that the Dragon King was spewing. As soon as the flames ended, all the water near the island began to boil, and the Dragon King realized that he would not die from such a thing. Because there was so much dust on the island, Jinwoo was able to stealthily sneak up on the Dragon King and jump on his neck. Once he took a closer look at the scales, he realized that he looked like a Mamu. He started punching at one point with all his might, but the Dragon King knew where his opponent was and started hitting him with his big paw. However, Jinwoo managed to bounce to the side and thus summoned his shadow dragons, which pounced on the Dragon King at that very second and started biting him on his large neck. The second dragon also began to test him with its flames. The three dragons surrounded him on all sides. And our hero was on a dais and began to watch this. But soon he realized that he was not affected by the breath of the dragons under the leadership of Billion. On mistakes, his attacks and defenses are incomparable to nothing. No one has faced him before now, and he won't be able to overpower him in the same way that he helped straighten out the other dragons. Jinwoo began to realize that he needed a power more powerful than armor, capable of cracking a mountain with his bare hands. And then it came to him that he could use his armor. As soon as the Dragon King dealt with the shadow dragons, Jinwoo began to say that he couldn't be broken by such a small thing. Suddenly, the Dragon King saw that the elevated area around Jinwoo was accumulating dark power. He wondered what he was up to, but Jinwoo realized that he would surround himself with a dark aura-like armor and create black armor. And even bigger, even stronger. The energy was so immense that everything else seemed insignificant in comparison. The Dragon King, looking at all of this, realized that this was an immortal body. This was impossible for him, because the Shadow Lord was originally a fragment of light. So this would be his true appearance. It was incomprehensible how he could be so huge, and he realized that he was summoning the power of death into their reality. And someone who was just a simple man not long ago, the Dragon King wondered this question about how deep his connection to the other world was. When all the dark energy accumulated near our hero, he realized that this was the true power of the Shadow Lord that Osborn had given him. Deep within his body, a power as enticing as bottomless darkness grew, and he became a Dragon King. When the dark energy glowing Jinwoo approaches him, he realizes that he has spent a lot of time on the brink of life and death and realizes the reason why Osborn, a past Shadow Lord, decided to pass his power to a mere human. This man had constantly fought with his own shadow before receiving such power. There is definitely a price to pay for this man's life, and the Dragon King decides to kill him now because he has proven to be too dangerous. At the flame that the Dragon King once again spewed out, Jinwoo was able to block it with his dark energy, and he received a huge roll of thunder in response. And so they met, and now this battle was about to end, but who would be able to win? That was what they were now determined to find out. As soon as they collided, the energies of flame and darkness began to erupt in different directions like a tsunami. The two terrifying forces glared one at the other, and the Dragon King swung his huge paw, preparing to strike Jinwoo, who was in his armor in berserk mode. But Jinwoo was able to parry his strike and retaliated with a punch to his big muzzle. As soon as they leaped into the sky, the Dragon King grabbed him with his big teeth and started throwing him in different directions. Jinwoo flew off and fell to the ground motionless. But suddenly, he opened his eyes and saw a huge flame flying at him, which was being exhaled by the Dragon King himself. As the flames engulfed the entire island, most of the flames did not hit our hero. He did, however, manage to cut off one arm. But it turned out that it was only armor. In his other hand, a dark sword appeared, which he began to use to fight the Dragon King. Thus, he became so strong that dark energy and flames started flying in different directions. The Dragon King cried out in pain, but then swung his big tail and hit Jinwoo, who flew off to the side. The Dragon King then started flying upwards towards the mountains and huge fireballs appeared around him, which immediately started attacking the entire island as well as the place where Jinwoo was. When the dust settled after the battle, dark energy flew from the island in response, which severed the Dragon King's one wing. Following the first clot of dark energy, the rest flew. They developed because the dark energy clots were flying towards the Dragon King. But the Dragon King noticed it and started spewing flames. It all collided and there was a huge explosion that began to cover the entire island, and the waves that enveloped this island began to flow in different directions. As the dust began to settle, Jinwoo's armor began to disintegrate, and eventually, he fell out of that armor and fell to the ground. He sighed and realized that it must be hard to maintain such an armor, and it used up too much magical energy. The Dragon King started to say that So-and-so would give him another chance, and before it was too late, he should join him and become a Shadow Lord, then maybe the king would spare him. But the armor that was still on our hero's body began to appear, and Jinwoo began to reply to the Dragon King that he wasn't interested in cooperating with monsters like him. The Dragon King thought this was too rude and began to pull out his huge sword with his hand. As soon as their eyes met, they shifted and began to fight in human form, but almost human. Their blades began to make very loud noises and the Dragon King began to say that there would be no mercy for him and he would turn him to ashes and everything he held dear and his family and friends that he was so desperate to protect would die and he could fight all he wanted. However, even as King of the Dead, he will still be a man who fears death itself. If he wants to experience the power of the flames that will burn him to the ground, then even the super heavens are powerless before him. Soon the whole world will turn to ashes, and his pathetic dreams into illusions. And surely he must have already realized what Osborn's power is, the endless cries of suffering of people from all over the world. This is War, the song of the army of destruction summarizing the existence of mankind. Jinwoo must hear these pleas for help. Let their despair penetrate his heart, and he will die and regret his choices. But after hearing everything, Jinwoo replied that it was so strange, because he wanted to tell him the same thing. It should have been nearing the end of this battle, but the dagger that was in the air started to turn towards the Dragon King. Jinwoo, who was sitting on the earth, bounced to the side at the same moment. The same blade that was in the air started flying towards the Dragon King, but froze near his barrier. The Dragon King began to call Jinwoo's name, calling him a fool and pointing out that the dagger created from the Dragon Fang wouldn't be able to harm him. After all, it was ridiculous. The flame born from darkness and the darkness that emerged from light were finally clashing in a bloody battle, and the end was near. Jinwoo, who was standing behind the Dragon King, was in agreement, for he already knew how it would end, and he decided to resist anyway. And just as Jinwoo started to run away, the Dragon King swung his sword and said, "The flames will consume him, for he has decided to cut off the head of the fool who dared to substitute himself as monarch. And by doing so he would raise the morale of the army of destruction. The brighter the light of the sun, the darker the darkness." And just as the sun began to appear over the horizon, our hero attacked the Dragon King. In response, the Dragon King started shouting that he would tear him to pieces and he would become food for flies. The hottest death awaited him only if he dared to resist the Dragon King. But Jinwoo didn't think so. For he swung, and his blades appeared in his hand. One moment, he was a completely different person, a Dark Lord, but the next moment, he was again who he was originally, a little boy just beginning his journey. At the very moment he swung, Jinwoo said to the Dragon King one last time that didn't he already realize that this was his end. And at the same moment, his father's blade appeared in his hand. Thus, the Dragon King's armor began to crack, and our hero overpowered him by cutting him in half. And the Dragon King realized that he had managed to hit it after all, and with a single blow. He hadn't expected to break through his defenses and the gate where they had come from, and when they had arrived, the link between the two worlds was not easy to connect, and it would take at least immense power to do so. The Dragon King wondered about the ruler's army here. Was it really his original plan and he wanted to face it in battle to release the energy accumulated here and summon allies? After all, he had thought that he had deliberately dragged him into such a wilderness so that no one could interfere with them, but only played into his hands. And the Dragon King asked Jinwoo how he had found out about this method, to which Jinwoo replied that it was very simple, through the vessels and the remaining fragments of light endowed with the power of the rulers. They were the ones who helped him, and the Dragon King realized that it was with their help. He had created this gate from 10,000 options, and he had chosen the one that, despite his defeat, guaranteed total victory in the war. It was very sad, and the Dragon King realized that this was the end for him. Jinwoo began to say that it was him after all, he was the Dragon King. He spoke of the Demon King, the Ram and the Beast Lord betraying the Chosen One, and the Dragon King replied that it wasn't the puppy who had told him everything, but Jinwoo countered that it was Osborne who had told him everything. And by the way, he said hello to you, Dragon King. Our hero showed him his middle finger, and the Dragon King got angry about it and started running towards Jinwoo. But the rulers who came down from the heavens pierced the Dragon King with their spears. With that, the Dragon King realized that it was the brightest shard of light, and it was now clear to him that he originally had no chance of winning. But he knew that he would still meet him and would wait for him with the circumstances he had created. But Jinwoo answered him not to worry, for they would meet her very soon. And as soon as the Dragon King dissolved, one of the rulers who had come down and stood on the ground began to say that he had put an end to their war, and he didn't know how to thank him. Jinwoo started to say that it might be too brazen of him, but he had one request, and it was something only a ruler could do. And the ruler replied that he would do his best to help him. To which our hero said, "Can they use the cup of rebirth once more?" The rulers began to ask what he wanted with their help. To rewind time, to which Jinwoo replied that that's right, even if they use the cup of recollection, the higher beings won't change, and he still wants to rewind time. Even though the newly living monarchs would remember everything, everything was correct. Jinwoo started saying that he wanted magic to leave this world and people to live ordinary lives, and he would deal with the monarchs himself and destroy their army between dimensions. To which the ruler didn't understand why he was going to fight them alone. They had used the goblet so many times, but only now were they able to achieve a perfect result. But Jinwoo answered him that this war had taken too many innocent lives, so he wanted to bring them back. But the rulers began to talk amongst themselves that the goblet was at its limit, and if he failed, they would most likely no longer be able to rewind time. And he could remain in people's memories as the hero who single-handedly defeated the monarchs. However, in the new world, only he will know what happened. Total annihilation awaits him if he is defeated, and he can never be reborn again. And even if he wins, no one will know about it, and given these circumstances, he still wants to use the goblet. Jinwoo smiled as he started to remember the fact that right now his family was sitting in front of the TV watching everything that had happened, and his girlfriend was fighting monsters, and the president of the association was in his office with Jinho. Jinwoo gets to his feet and says that this is exactly what he wants, because he has a place to go back to. The ruler replied to him that it means he wants to save the whole world, and in his eagerness to carry such an impossible burden on himself alone, thus he now reminds him of Osborne, the previous Shadow Lord. Well, of course, the rulers eventually agreed, and he will pray for his success. But suddenly, Jinwoo stopped him and asked him what would happen to his Shadow Wars that didn't exist back then, to which the ruler began to say that they would disappear in the flow of time. And after these words, Jinwoo said that he was ready, and the rulers began to raise the goblet that reverses time. They said, "Let his courage save this world." After these words, a radiating light appeared and began to envelop the entire planet. That light that began to shine through all cities, all places, and all planets was hunting everyone, and the friends of Hunter Jinwoo and his family who were looking out the window and seeing the bright light that was turning on right at them. The president of the association was also standing by the window, and the hunter I was now fighting the monsters that were falling from their swords. All of them, as well as Hunter Cha, who was standing on Earth and remembering her lover, were looking at this bright burst of light that went right past them, and the whole planet went back to a time that had not yet begun in any of the houses. Little Gina ran to her brother's room to wake him. Jenna came running to him after her water treatments, and the smell that filled the kitchen and the measured clatter of the knife on the chalkboard and the air in the room absorbed the scent. His skin still quite young. Jinwoo walked into the kitchen and saw his family in front of him, his mother, who was cooking, and his little sister, who sat watching TV. Tears started to fall down his face. And it looked like he was having a nightmare, he thought. But it was all right. This horrible dream was finally over and dissolved in the warm rays of the morning sun and in the happy smiles of his little sister, his mother, who was healthy, and his father, who was alive, and he had a chance to fix everything, and he would never miss it now. The future is in his hands, however. Just for a moment, just a little bit, he decided to let himself enjoy carefree days, at least as a reward for all the suffering he has endured, and he knows, as long as life is cheerful, smile at your memories of each day somewhere up there in heaven, the ruler's honor, a suitable occasion to carry out his plan. Therefore, just a little bit more, just a little bit more. He wants to savor this feeling of leaving, as long as it hurts no one, and very little Jean wished at least for one day to be allowed to prolong it. That same day, his mom, who was cleaning the apartment, looked at the note her son had left, saying that he would be back after he finished a case. And that business was that he wanted to slay all the monsters that were in his path with his shadow army. In a world of silence where only darkness existed, it was unbearably boring without battles, and by holding victory after victory, he was finally able to reach the monarch of the demonic ghosts and foil the plan to create a huge gate. And now, 27 years later, in interdimensional space, at last, the outcome of this protracted, brutal, but boring war has become visible. All that remains is to defeat the Dragon Lord and his army of destruction. Time flowed much faster in this world, and now about 2 years had passed on Earth. That was quite a long time. And he wondered how Mom, Dad, and his sister were doing, and if she had changed much. Maybe he should have explained things to them before he left. And as soon as at least he had soldiers, he told them that they had won and all the enemies were dead. Jinwoo answered him that he wouldn't lose this time either. And at the same time, the Dragon King heard the news that the transformation was dead. Even though he was told that they could retreat, he decided that he wasn't going to run away anymore. He sat on his throne and realized that the Shadow Lord was truly incredible. After all, he had not expected that he would decide to turn back time with the naval rebirth, and thus they would meet him again in the world of the living. However, now one of them would have to return to oblivion forever, and just as he finished his musings, Jinwoo appeared in front of him, the one they had started fighting the last battle with. It's been 2 years since Sun Jinwoo left the human world. An eerie prophecy has shaken the whole of America, foretelling that a death-bearing deity will soon come upon the world. It would seem that this was another prediction of the doom of all mankind, but not when Norma Selner speaks of it. She predicted that an evil deity would descend to Earth and bring his immortal army after him, and mankind is doomed to perish. It's inevitable. 2 years ago, rumors began to spread around the world about a female fortune-teller. She was able to accurately determine the date and time of death of the dictator of North Korea, predicted terrorist attacks, the collapse of the stock market, the world crisis, and much more. Her personality was often at the center of scandals. And of course, she also predicted events related to humanity. Everyone was shocked, and the next day, as it was said in the prediction, a huge black hole appeared above the power investigation. After that, the whole world knew, and everyone who was watching didn't realize what was going on there until some strange crack started to open up. But suddenly they realized that nothing was happening. Sung Jin-woo, who was coming out of the people, met a man with flowers and heard that he was nervous because Sung Jin-woo wouldn't be coming home, and he didn't expect him to arrive in the guise of a middle schooler. To which Sung Jin-woo replied to him that he was definitely scared of him in his normal form, and it was nice that at least someone was meeting him. But when the man began to speak, he honestly admitted that he didn't believe in the success of his mission until the last. But now he could clearly see that his day had nourished maybe tens of thousands of soldiers, and Song Jin-woo asked him if he was sure that he had come here not only to present him with this bouquet, but that he owed something to the envoy of the rulers. The messenger said that the rulers wanted to give him something and it would be a long conversation and they could go somewhere private. To which Song Jin-woo said that she had just the right place in mind, because he wanted to come to an ice cream parlor, and he didn't think that he had anything wrong. He hadn't had a sweet for as long as 27 years, and unfortunately they don't sell it in the desert lands. Song Jin-woo asked the messenger what the rulers wanted to convey to him, but the messenger replied that it was nothing, they were just very grateful to him. But Song Jin-woo didn't like this answer and said that he could bite off these formalities and get to the point, to which the envoy took his hint and shook his hand, acknowledging the truthfulness of his words. There is no problem with his power, and in fact, the rulers are concerned about his growing power, which could affect the laws. Perhaps he himself is well aware that this world is not ready to accept him, and without magic, it is vulnerable to his power. Therefore, with Song Jinwoo's permission, they would like to ask him to leave this dimension in search of a world that can accept such an enormous power of a Shadow Lord. Song Jinwoo asked the envoy if it would be better to seal her power. The messenger replied that that was right, that option was also possible. Song Jin-woo then said that now that he had finally destroyed all of their enemies, some people had decided to get rid of her and were afraid of his power. To which the messenger with a frightened face started pulling something out of his pocket and held out his phone, asking Song Jin-woo to read the message he said the god of death had given to the earthlings. This message said that the god of death would not come to earth, and just before his return, Selner had predicted the doom of the world. She had become like that due to the collision of their worlds, and Sung Jin-woo wondered what they were trying to say, that it was his fault that she had become like that. The messenger replied that it was correct. But Song Jin-woo started to say that they can't talk about it later, and the messenger stood up and apologized. He said that was the end of his mission here. And if every living soul had a specific purpose, then he could safely say that his role as the savior of this world was finally over. And that would be it. And the power gained in favor of that purpose, as ironic as it may sound, was the reason why everything could come to an end. And in this case he has a question: maybe this world really doesn't need him anymore, or maybe it is still some kind of delusion, and our hero thinks that one day the time will come when he will be able to find the answer to this question. However, he has already found it. The true reason for his existence lies in those people who are indifferent to him, and that is why it is because of the people who are so indifferent to him that he must stay here forever. And that's what he decided, to follow his heart and protect all the people living on this planet. To find the love he once lost in a past life and stay with her now until the very end. Here are 1,000 reasons to never leave this world again. Minor spoiler: we return to middle school student Sung Jin-woo in another world, as well as the long-awaited continuation of the story of Sung Jin-woo's high school life, and a touching reunion with Jin Shul, and new acquaintances that weren't possible in a previous life, and the eternal battle of the Shadow Army. And the romantic couple story will be the embroidery on the cake, and it's all waiting for you in the next video. By a sense of loss, as if he had forgotten something important. No matter how much he thought about it, he had forgotten nothing, and the more often such thoughts visited him, the more the emptiness in his heart grew. The man who was pouring him coffee asked him what was troubling him so much. Jinchul replied that everything was fine, and he was so busy with work that he had no time to be sad and needed to get on with things. As soon as they got upstairs, they saw a man walking and shaking all over. Jinchul was wondering who they were, those men who had been apprehended. One of those men was walking and muttering something to himself about some monsters and a shadow that was chasing him, and that a shadow came out of the ground and told him that it would kill him, and if he didn't surrender within 24 hours he would regret being alive. And he started yelling in the detective's direction that it was all his fault and it was important to send him to jail as soon as possible. Jinchul was curious as to what it was all about and asked him that they had all seen some kind of monster. but he heard that was correct. He was wondering how he was supposed to report this to the management, but suddenly a man came up to Jinchul and started telling him to put the report to Junior and come to the conference room. A little later, one of the researchers in the conference room started saying, "What if we want to release the criminal? I don't understand why we want to do that." But then a man intervened and said that they didn't just want to let them out, they wanted to see what would happen to them in 24 hours if they were put outside. To this the Chinchilla objected that they were just stoned and that's why they were talking such nonsense. Maybe they're just having monsters and hallucinations are the new side effects. However, the guy behind them claimed that the drug test came back negative, and he even went to the National Forensic Medical Service to make sure. But the Jinchul still didn't understand what they were trying to say, and why all these criminals were unrelated. Despite orders from the top to sort things out, they had no idea how to get any clue. Then the man started to say that they just needed to recreate the situation in which they were spouting their nonsense. But the Jinchul detective decided to ask, what would happen if something really happened? Those men started laughing and telling him that he really believed in a ghost. I mean, you can't really say that, but he seems to be more emotional than they thought. One of the investigators started saying that nothing would happen if they send one criminal to some abandoned warehouse and see what happens. A bunch of brave detectives would keep an eye on him, and because of that, he wouldn't be able to go anywhere. And even if they let the monster show up in 24 hours, like he says he will, shouldn't they thank him? And they all started thinking they needed a volunteer. Your investigators asked Jinchul if he wasn't comfortable he might not participate, but he turned them down and said he would go. A little while later they were in one of the abandoned warehouses, and that prisoner who was afraid of some shadow started yelling for them not to do it, because he would die. But one of the detectives went up to him and started telling him to sit still, because they were conducting an investigation. No one is going to die here, and they're going to be right there with him. One investigator asked Detective Kim, how much longer until 24 hours? To which Detective Kim replied that approximately about 10 minutes. Investigator Jinchul, who was standing not far away, began to notice that for some reason the air didn't seem the same to him as usual. Time was up. You didn't realize anything was going on, and one of the detectives turned to the inmate, asking him, he's definitely not using anything, and he should tell the truth, and then they'll all feel better. But the prisoner still sat there, full of fear, and began to say that they had seen that monster, after all. And there were actually 4 of them. At the same moment, Jinchul began to feel something. No one here is going to die, and they're going to be right there with him. One researcher asked Detective Kim, how much longer until 24 hours? To which Detective Kim replied that it was about 10 minutes. Investigator Jinchul, who was standing not far away, began to notice that for some reason the air seemed different to him than usual. As time ticked away, they realized nothing was happening. One of the detectives turned to the inmate and asked him, he's definitely not using anything, and he should tell the truth and then they'll all feel better. But the prisoner still sat there full of fear and began to say that they had seen that monster, after all. There were actually 4 of them. At the same moment Jinchul began to feel something and shouted to his companions to get out of here as soon as possible, for the shadow that was near them began to move. In an instant, the shadow hit 2 of the investigators, causing them to fly off and crash into the gate, rendering them unconscious. The prisoners who were seated began to sob. He saw before him terrifying shadows in the form of 3 ants. Jinchul couldn't believe his eyes. There were 3 of them, and as soon as the prisoner wanted to escape, the monsters pounced on him and started tearing him to pieces in different directions. Researcher Jinchul, who was watching all this, couldn't believe what was happening. His legs began to shake as he saw the terrifying shadow ants in front of him, who killed the prisoner in an instant. Remarkably, one of the ants that looked at him began to smirk, and more importantly, he could tell by the look in their eyes that they were happy to meet him. As if there was a time when he had been in situations like this and he couldn't figure out what that could mean. And a little while later, the head of the department started yelling at them that they had gotten themselves worked up, that a criminal who had voluntarily turned himself in had disappeared without a trace, and the detectives had let themselves get knocked out. He started switching to investigator Jinchul and asking him if he was the one who called the ambulance and if he remembered anything. He started to say that he only remembered when he came to and everyone else was lying unconscious. The department head stated that luckily nothing is known from above, so everyone should keep quiet as a fish about everything that happened. They were all investigating a case of a gang of thugs who had injured themselves in the execution of a crime. When everyone understood and went to their desks, Investigator Jinchul was sitting in his office at his computer and a junior investigator came up to him. He began to ask why he wanted to continue investigating the case of those criminals, since the chief had told them to forget all about it. But Jinchul realized that he was just curious, and he wanted to look into something. He was interested in why there was an outbreak of crime because of those monsters, and why the number of surrenders had increased significantly from the end of February to the beginning of March. He wondered how it all connected. Although it was nothing much, the younger investigator started to say that it was just that his aunt had a small book rental store, and late February and early March was the same time of school, and he remembered her complaining that her business wasn't doing well during that time. It wasn't until the younger investigator finished speaking that Jinchul turned on him and told him to remember that just in case. The next day, all the school kids started to gather outside their school and go inside. And at the same time, inside the school, the principal held out the file of one of the students and started saying that a problem child was about to be admitted to their school. As soon as the teacher took that file, he started reading that that child's father was a fireman and his mother was a regular housewife. And he even had good grades, and he didn't see any problems. But the principal said he looked at the paragraph below and the teacher started reading that this student ran away from home for 2 years, was in elementary school, not high school. The principal started asking the teacher what he thought about this and if he could handle him, to which the teacher replied that didn't he know why he was nicknamed Viper. The principal decided to trust him with this problem child and there would be no more problems from him. When all the new students gathered outside the stadium, the Viper walked around with his stick and started yelling at everyone to shut up. At that same moment, he spotted that problem student. It was Sung Jin-woo. The Viper was already approaching him, and he was confident that no matter how corrupt he was, he would make an obedient sheep out of him. Suddenly, he saw the glove that was on one of Sung Jin-woo's hands and thought that it was out of order. He was ready to show who was the owner, and began to shout in the direction of our hero, asking where he was, that he put on the gloves. But as soon as Sung Jin-woo turned around to see who was yelling at him, at that moment the Viper teacher saw a force that was incomprehensible to him, and which he could not accept. At the same moment he turned around and started yelling at the other students to all shut up and stand at attention. The teacher was sweating at that moment, and he could not understand what had happened or what he had imagined. Sung Jin-woo stood as his commander-in-chief, the Baron, approached him and began to speak. He said that it seemed like they could be seen, and it turns out that it was also one of his influences on this world. A little later, in one of the classrooms, Sung Jin-woo was sitting at his desk reading a book. Suddenly, one of the students came up to him and started asking him if he was the same Sung Jin-woo. He replied that he was him, Jill, and that they were in the first grade of middle school together. He went on to say that he lived nearby and moved here last year. But suddenly this guy was pushed to the side by someone, and 4 guys came up to Sung Jin-woo and surrounded him on all sides. They started asking Sung Jin-woo, why is he so important that he's wearing a glove? And only on his left hand. Does he have 8th grade syndrome? And they started making fun of him for having a black fire dragon in his left hand. Sung Jin-woo realized that already in this school, some students had created their own hierarchy, and those students started telling him to take off his glove. One of the students wanted to put it on his hand, and they didn't understand why he was silent or had his ears popped. One of the students started to say to Sung Jin-woo in a serious tone, he was told to take off his gloves, why is he silent? Or could he be hiding some tattoo there? And at the same second, a berserk shadow appeared and started telling his king that with his permission, he would immediately chop up their bodies so that they couldn't approach anymore. But Sung Jin-woo didn't like this and said that he forbade it. Immediately after that, he began to take off his glove and show the disciples who were standing around were shocked at what they saw. The hand was as if it had been poisoned. This was all because it was a wound inflicted by the Dragon King. It's the one thing he can't cure. And those guys who started to say why he was getting so serious suddenly decided to leave, recognizing that everything was just a joke. Now he can put his coiffure back on. After all, they were afraid it would haunt them in their nightmares, and it was an unpleasant experience for them. At that very second, Sung Jin-woo noticed that BR wanted to follow them to straighten them out, and told him where he was going and to stop following him. After all, it would be much better when things were peaceful and calm. And then Sung Jin-woo started to use his force, causing all those guys to stumble and fall to the floor. Sung Jin-woo smiled and told his commander that it was just a joke, and then ended the lesson. The guy who had approached him in the beginning was walking down the corridor. He said that he had changed a lot in these 3 years and didn't even move in front of those freaks. So he decided to ask if he had been practicing all this time. Sang Jin-woo answered him that he had been practicing a lot, and that guy asked when he would join some athletic club. And about the circles, there was a place he wanted to join, and a little later, they went to the stadium where the captain of the athletics club was standing. He wondered why he wanted to join the club, and even more so the two of them. But Sang Jin-woo answered him that no, the two of them don't want to join, only him, but the members of the athletics club who were standing nearby looked at our hero with disdain. They wondered who was there who wanted to join the club. After all, this was the first time they had ever seen a first-year want to join, and they were impressed. The club captain started to ask Sang Jin-woo if he wanted to join a sports university and if he had done running in middle school. Sang Jin-woo answered him that he didn't. But the guys who started coming up started saying that the only people here were those who were going to enter a sports university, and why would he join the athletics club if he hadn't even done any running before? Sang Jin-woo replied to them that there is someone he wants to meet at the competition. Although she is on the middle school team, she is already good enough to compete in regionals. She was an excellent track and field athlete until she became a hunter and gave up on her dream. Then Sang Jin-woo would be able to naturally meet her at the competitions where middle and high school students would compete. The captain replied to him that he agreed, but there was one condition. He pointed to one of the boys who was warming up on the treadmill and started saying that he was the worst runner in their circle among the second years. He must run faster than him to join the club. However, Sang Jin-woo realized as soon as he looked at this guy that seeing his thinness, strong thighs and calves, and the confidence emanating from his body, one could tell that this was an obvious lie. Nevertheless, he replied that he would give it a try anyway. One of the club members who was standing nearby was thinking about how this guy didn't even recognize the person who had placed third at the regionals, and how he was even going to join the track and field club. The club captain went on to say that just running isn't interesting. If he wins, he can join them. And if he loses, he will do laundry and cleaning for a month for free. But Sang Jin-woo still answered him that he was willing. So at this time, the teacher, a viper, was in the teacher's lounge when a girl came up to him and started asking him if he was feeling better. He answered her that he was fine now, and he was ready to go out for a smoke. As soon as he took out his cigarette and lit it, he looked out the window and saw that freshman who had recently come to this school running on the treadmill. He wondered why he was practicing with the track and field kids. The teacher, who was standing behind the viper's back, started asking him what his class was and why student Sang Jin-woo was running with the guys from the track and field club, to which he replied that his name was Sang Jin-woo and he was the new kid. He wanted to join the club himself, and he had done well in the test. So they didn't refuse him, and now they are testing his stamina. This is already his 20th lap, and he was tired of watching, so he came up here. The teacher, a viper, thought about the fact that he didn't seem to be problematic, and it seems he had the wrong opinion of him. He decided to follow him without prejudice and maybe then the misunderstanding would disappear. But as soon as the viper teacher raised his head again, his face changed at that very second and his right eye began to water. He screamed at the top of his voice, for he saw some terrifying energy and shadow moving behind Sang Jin-woo again. He couldn't understand what kind of hallucination he was having, because it couldn't be like this. And suddenly, he saw that something had obscured the window he was looking through, and in front of him was a terrifying shadow ant that started screaming back at him. And immediately the teacher, the viper, fell to the floor and stopped moving, but the other teacher could not understand what had happened to him. And Iris, who was standing outside the window, began to tell the ant that that was why he had told him not to do that. After all, he really could see them. That same day in the evening, the investigators decided to eat at a restaurant, and the junior investigator started asking his mentor what he had investigated so far in the case of the missing prisoner. He had, after all, actually seen something that day. But Jinchul didn't understand what day he was talking about. To which the guy continued, "Talk about the day the criminal went missing." The junior investigator decided to ask again if he really didn't see anything that day. But Jinchul realized that he had seen those terrifying monster ants, and began to say that he couldn't say exactly what he saw then, but they looked like ants. The junior investigator interjected about monster ants, and he wants to say that there were giant insects like ants. But Jinchul didn't fully understand if they were ants. A man passing by heard them talking and started talking about how these monster ants were monsters with the heads of ants, but with bodies like human bodies. The next day in the school stadium, the students ran away with all their might, for their goal was to conquer the whole country. One of the students began to question his captain, wasn't their goal to win regionals? But the captain began to reply that he was thinking too small, for their goal was to conquer the whole country. Our hero, who was running ahead, didn't understand why that guy followed him if he was having such a hard time. The barrier that appeared in the form of a shadow began to tell his lord that people are stupid creatures. At the same moment, Sud Jinwoo started using his strength, causing that guy who was barely running behind him to start speeding up. He didn't realize what was happening to him, as his body began to burn violently. Suddenly those guys who were running behind saw the boy in front of them, who with all his might started to run even faster. They began to tell everyone to take a look at their rookie's fighting spirit, and they should in no way give in to him. At the same time, the Viper teacher, who was watching from the window all the students who were running in the stadium, looked at them with disdain and started to remember the day when he was in a restaurant and talked to two guys about how monster ants were monsters with the heads of ants but with bodies like human bodies. Suddenly he realized he was starting to talk some nonsense, apologized to the investigators, telling them he was very drunk and they shouldn't pay attention to him. The investigators, who had had a blast, caught up with him and asked if he could tell them more. Court Jinwoo, who was standing near the tree, realized that that teacher lately didn't even hide the fact that he was staring at him all the time. Barayan started to tell his lord that wouldn't it be easier to erase that person's memory and take away his abilities, but Court Jinwoo decided to just observe him for a little longer. The researcher stood not far from the school and only thought about the fact that the suspects who encountered the monsters and the students' monsters have a connection that only one of the teachers can see. They feel it intuitively, but the problem is that they don't know how to ask that student about such a phenomenon. If they ask him if he knows anything about shadow monsters or ants that straighten up and walk like humans, he will probably take them for crazy. Suddenly, the investigator turned his eyes to the ground and saw a shadow that crawled past him. It was then that he realized that there was definitely something strange about this school. A little later, Court Jinwoo, who was sitting on the back desk in his classroom and twirling a pen in his hands, realized that the investigator had noticed the guard after all. As expected of the former president of the Hunters Association, Jin Shul, he had memories of his past life, but his beast eyes remained in place. The researcher who walked into the classroom started to tell the teacher that actually what he came to do was nothing serious, he just wanted to ask a couple questions to a student named Sud Jinwoo. And just as he started to get up from his desk, some of the students slapped him in the back for what he did. It looked like he was really getting in trouble. And as soon as Sud Jinwoo left the classroom and they met with the investigator, he started saying that he was apologizing for just pulling him out of class. But Court Jinwoo realized that not only years, but even decades had passed since he had last seen him. If he added more time while he wandered in the space between dimensions, he was happy to see him, but if he opened up now, he would take him for a lunatic. And the investigator who was looking at Jinwoo Court realized that there was something about this guy. After all, how could a disciple have such a look? The researcher took out a notebook from his pocket and showed it to his student Sud Jinwoo, asking him if he had accidentally seen something similar in the picture. There was an ant drawn on the notebook, and Sud Jinwoo realized that this researcher was much more talented in art than he had realized. In response to a question, he said that he had seen monsters like the one pictured in fantasy series. The researcher began to ask questions, finding out if Jinwoo Court knew what it was and who these monsters really were. However, right after these questions, the investigator apologized and said that he was a little carried away. He explained that he has been working on this case for a long time and sometimes he has strange reactions. A request to take the drawing as a memento caused the investigator to have a strange look on his face and he refused, starting to talk about not looking at such groups and vulgar scribbles. Court Jinwoo was surprised at this reaction, but suggested that the investigator return the notebook to the classroom so that there would be no problem. Thus, the situation with the notebook and the monster drawing was resolved, and Jinwoo Court continued the learning process in the classroom. Immediately after that, the investigator started to leave, but Igris, who started to appear as a shadow from the ground, started to ask his lord why he didn't tell the truth to that person. But Sud Jinwoo answered him that if he knew the ability to forget God's blessing to people, even if it was an artificial result of God's tool, and Igris immediately understood. Sud Jinwoo started to go back to his class, and a little later, when he went back to the girl who was in that class, people started to come up to him and ask him questions. What happened there and why did the detective come to him? But Sud Jinwoo started telling them that it was an acquaintance of his and he just stopped by to ask something. Those girls were surprised, because from his close ones, he has a detective and they heard that he has a nice body and they know what he does. They also saw him running in the stadium with the other guys the day before yesterday. With a slight smile, but suddenly one of the students came over, pushed the girl aside and started telling our hero that he was looking at him. And his popularity didn't even go so far as a policeman when he walked in. He started poking his dirty finger in Sud Jinwoo's face. Your joke seems to go beyond the boundaries of good tone, and it's considered schoolyard tomfoolery. Are you going to tell a detective about it, or do you want to go outside? Someone asked. Court Jin-woo realized that he had better calm down while he was in a good mood. Suddenly, someone grabbed him by the neck and started pulling him aside. It turned out to be the guys from the track and field team. They explained that they had come to warn him of the danger and took him to the captain of the track and field team. Court Jin-woo got up from behind his desk and asked why they had come. The guys replied that they were holding a freshman welcome party and wanted to meet him. When Sud Jin-woo agreed, the athletics captain suggested they meet after school. After school, they went outside to run around the court. Soon after school, the entire track and field club went with Sud Jin-woo, her friend, and the captain down the street. The captain started to ask Sud Jin-woo what happened to those idiots who harassed him during class and if they could punish them for it. But Sud Jin-woo answered him that it was fine and she didn't want them to get in trouble in the competition. Suddenly, Sud Jin-woo heard someone calling her. It was an investigator who was standing around the corner. He started asking if they could talk again. The guys from the track club started to walk on and said that they would hold his friend hostage until he came to the party. When everyone dispersed, Sud Jin-woo was in the park with the investigator and he started telling her that her friend's life was at stake, so she couldn't stay here too long. The investigator bluntly said that he thought she was really the person they were looking for. Because when Sung Jin-woo took the drawing from under the notebook in his hands, and when he asked to keep it as a memento, it seemed like an insignificant little thing. But it's things like this that leave a big mark on history. Just as he thought, it's all just silly speculation. And as the investigator walked down the steps, he began to hear words about the president of the association and whether or not to trust him. But he didn't know what it was about, so he decided to turn around to look at Sung Jin-woo again. But he wasn't at the spot where he was standing just a second ago. Suddenly, the investigator began to remember that in his past life, he had interacted with this guy and told him that he trusted him. In that case, he hoped that Sung Jin-woo would believe everything he was about to show him. He began to remember all the events that had happened before and had somehow been forgotten. He didn't understand what it was, and suddenly, he realized that in those memories, the name of that very same disciple of Sung Jin-woo had come up. These were memories linking the past, present, and future, as well as bits and pieces of the forgotten world seen by Hunter Sung Jin-woo. Gates, monsters, hunters, lord and lords, the investigator couldn't believe it. After all, how could such a thing even be possible? And only the investigators who used to be the head of the Hunters Association asked him if he was going to fight them alone. But Sung Jin-woo knew that the memories of a supreme being were not affected by time, and as he walked through the park, the investigator started asking how long he had been fighting them between dimensions. According to Sung Jin-woo's records, he had been missing for about 2 years, but 2 years wasn't enough time to defeat them all. Sung Jin-woo started to tell the investigator that for 27 years, he fought them in the other worlds. So the investigator decided to ask Sung Jin-woo if he regretted it, and Sung Jin-woo said he didn't. If he was given this opportunity over and over again, he would make the same decision every time. The researcher asked him what he was doing now, and Sung Jin-woo replied that he was living a fun life and was content, and his body was no longer aging. Therefore, he has to constantly change it, and he has gained the divine power of eternal youth and immortality. However, with this power, he decided to live the life of a common man, and if this path he chose is the way it is. The researcher asked after these thoughts if he had thought about what he would do in the future, but Sung Jin-woo replied that he didn't have any plans yet. The researcher suggested him to join the national police, because lately, surrendered criminals have been complaining about the shadow monsters and saying that they can't live because of them. But Sung Jin-woo realized that if he became a police officer, there would be no work. To the investigator, he replied that to such a creature of the world strive to give their best every day. Sung Jin-woo said he would think about it and started to leave. Lastly, the investigator said he would wait for his answer, but Sung Jin-woo said he better not. After all, everyone knows that there is tons of work and the pay is small. That's how time went by, until suddenly in late April, a tourist who was currently traveling in the desert suddenly showed up and started calling 911. The girl who picked up the phone started asking if he was in trouble. To which the man replied that he wasn't really. She was curious as to what happened to him then, and the hiker began to tell her that he was not calling her because he was in trouble, but to report what he was seeing now. The 911 girl offered to send a rescue team if it was an emergency, but that tourist didn't know how to explain what he was seeing. The tourist wanted them to be able to send the necessary services to the scene. The tourist started to say that the building he was on was about to collapse and there were a lot of cracks on it. But the girl didn't fully understand what he meant. She started asking about the building that was about to collapse and where exactly those cracks were. But the tourist said that she was unlikely to believe him, and added that the sky was beginning to crack. At the same time, in the apartment where Sun Jinwoo Igris was staying, he first informed his lord that 20 for the matter should not be handled in this way. But while Sung Jinwoo was having dinner at the table, he began to feel something strange. That same evening, the ruler who met with the Shadow Lord began to say that they hadn't seen each other for a long time. Sung Jinwoo immediately began to ask him about the sky that began to fall apart. Was it their handiwork? To which the ruler began to reply that it's not them, for doesn't he himself know that this way of crossing dimensions is different from theirs? And the creatures that are trying to get here? Sung Jinwoo began to ask the ruler if he had any clues as to who they were. To which the ruler began to say that they are outsiders and not too long ago they tried to infiltrate their world and were defeated by the heavenly army. And it seems that they decided to try their luck in this world. But Sung Jinwoo was curious as to why they were trying to get here. To which the ruler began to explain that they are a race of giants who devour rocks found on planets natural for life. They are called the Terrace of the Titans, and even on their own world they stand out for their evil nature. And the reason for their invasion of Earth is pretty obvious, they're definitely not friends. But Sung Jinwoo wondered why they weren't there before using the rebirth bowl. And why did they appear just now? The ruler began to say that he was right in fact, talking about their invasions of their world not too long ago. He was referring to a timeline that had been crossed, meaning the beings that were supposed to come to their world had instead decided to invade Earth. And the whole reason for that was because there was a Shadow Lord on this land right now. I and these creatures were on the trail of the Overlord, who has incredible power, and at least that's the opinion of the other rulers. On this matter, the rulers had already sent the heavenly army, but Sun Jinwoo started to say that it was too late. After all, even if he didn't start creating a tunnel connecting their world to Earth right now, it would take them at least a few years to get here, and by then, it would be over, and he would take care of it himself. In the west of the United States, in the desert, the American government had closely detached the surrounding area and invited all sorts of experts to come here. But each of them could only come up with many meaningful hypotheses. For more than 30 years, he had investigated many strange weather phenomena around the world. But it was the first time they had seen something like this, and although they were not worried, even if something came from there, they would take care of it. But suddenly, the soldiers started to see that the tanks that were in this vicinity started to rise into the air. And all these tanks and trucks were being lifted into the air by our hero who was standing nearby. He knew that such weapons will not affect them in any way, because the arena of battle is almost ready. He could feel the intense hunger of the enemies who wanted to devour this land, and even their heavy breathing as if they were nearby. He was ready for them to come. In 30 moments they will only have to deal with one lord and one hunter. And as soon as the tanks began to fall to the ground and all the soldiers fell from the tanks, the commander of the unit, who was lying near one of the tanks, was in a terrible state, because he did not understand what was happening here. And as soon as he turned around, he saw a huge gate in the sky, from which horrible creatures began to come out and descend to the ground. And in front of them stood one man, to whom the horrible monsters began to ask questions. After all, they didn't realize that he wanted to stop them alone, but Sung Jinwoo realized that wasn't he alone. And at that very second, for money, I noticed a huge shadow begin to form and cover everything around me. The shadow became so huge that it enveloped all objects nearby. After that, a huge army of shadow soldiers appeared on Earth, ready to fight for their Shadow Lord. In their ranks were both commanders-in-chief and ordinary commanders and warriors. There were also 3 large dragons ready to tear everything to pieces. And once the entire Shadow Army was assembled and everyone was ready to fight to the death, Sun Jinwoo ordered everyone to start the war. At the same time, in the White House, the President of the United States was sitting in his office and began to think about the fact that in the middle of a clear sky, a rift appeared and something started to come out of it. It was an unprecedented situation, and whether it was possible to deal with it without wide publicity, began to torment him with this question. But he wondered, above all else, if they would even be able to deal with the ones coming out of there. A little later, he came out of his office and began to ask Harrison what he had just said. Harrison replied that everything he had learned was true and the case was already closed and he would explain everything in the conference room. They started showing the video and said that it was taken from the scene by drones and robots. The president who was watching the video didn't realize what was going on there and who was behind it, because it was some Asian boy. The president started asking, who is this man and where were their troops? Why is there a civilian standing in the middle of these creatures? But Harrison, who had begun to fix his cap, replied that he would like to know that too. That battle was too horrible for an audience of ordinary people, for there were monsters fighting there that the world had never seen before, at least not at this time. The terrifying stone monsters were fighting against shadow soldiers who were much stronger. Sung Jin-woo flew at the speed of light to attack his enemy, and he cut off the stone heads of those giants that stood in his way, while the ant army reached for all the others that fell to the ground. Our hero was too strong, and with his blades he slew most half of those monsters that were in his path. He began to summon large shadow blades, which began to fly towards the monsters and shatter them to pieces. The dark blades created by our hero flew towards the leader of those creatures, but he was able to block them and they bounced aside. That leader started to say that with such a small body, he wouldn't be able to defeat him. At the same time, Sung Jin-woo jumped up in the air and began to summon even more energy, which began to accumulate in his right hand. Thus, the blade became much larger, and he struck the leader of these creatures directly with it. This caused him to fall to the ground, and as soon as the smoke cleared, he began to say that he could now see that even on such a small planet, at the back of the universe, one could find valuable talents. But the fact that he can change his body size to increase his strength clearly shows how primitive his species is. And the one that Titans on the contrary, shrink in size when they need to fight hard. And of course, only the greatest warriors are capable of that, times and Titans like him, and if he asked for forgiveness, he would show him mercy. But at that very moment the Baryon who began to approach this Titan, and with his great sword he cut off his great stone head in an instant. And shortly after that, the Baryon began to say to his lord, maybe he wanted to talk to this creature, but Sung Jin-woo told him no. These guys seem a bit too cocky, so it looks like they'll have to pay close attention to them later. And after saying that, the Baryon began to say for the Shadow Lord to trust him to massacre the other monsters. And the president who was sitting in the conference room began to say, has anyone already established the identity of that guy? But he heard silence in response and began to think about how these monsters were like toys to him. He never thought that a scene from some movie would happen in reality and whether there was a way to reveal and confirm the identity of the person from that footage. But David Brandon, who was the director of America's Central Intelligence Agency, started saying that he doesn't even know if this is real and maybe it's unrealistic. But if we're talking about realistic ways, what about the fact that they would use unrealistic methods? The president didn't know what she was talking about, and he started to say that he knew there was some individual who could inform them of facts that nobody else knew, through fantastic methods. And it was Mrs. Norma Selner, as she had done before, she would clue them into the right answer this time too. The next day at the National Collegiate Athletics Championships, in the qualifying stage, Sung Jin-woo stood and watched as the other athletes began to warm up. Suddenly, he saw a guy and heard his name called. It was Kim Chul, and then Sung Jin-woo remembered that it was Iron, his former shadow soldier commander whom he had killed in one of the dungeons and turned him into his shadow general. The guy who was standing beside him started telling the track and field captain that he seemed to have lost his way, that he even allowed a freshman to participate in all kinds of competitions. He had heard that his former coach Woo San had gotten injured and was taking a break for a couple months. To this, the captain replied that he would soon not be able to catch up with Jaws, probably the athlete's name, in terms of talent in his first year. That guy started laughing back and said that instead of breaking records, he'd rather make jokes. After all, they too were once rookies themselves and realize how difficult it can be. Meanwhile, this beginner who was standing next to him began to feel some strange impulse that was overwhelming him, and in that very second, for some reason he wanted to fall on his knees in front of this student of his age whom he had never seen before. He began to wonder if it could be that he was being intimidated by a man of the same lineage as he was, and who was standing against him. And at that very second he began to shout in our hero's direction that this was ridiculous. That guy walked right up to Sung Jin-woo. After all, he didn't want to be afraid of a guy who would pass out after one punch, so he started saying that why is he looking like that? If you have something to say, then let's move away. The guys who were standing behind started laughing because the competition hadn't even started and there was already a fight looming. Some of the guys who were teamed up with Sung Jin-woo started telling him not to kill him before the competition started. The captain started telling Sung Jin-woo that he didn't want to spill any blood on the day of the competition after all, and he should imagine that he was saving his pathetic soul and let the kid still live. But Sung Jin-woo started to step back and tell his team not to worry, for he is sure nothing will happen there. As soon as they stepped back around one of the corners, Iron, who used to be on our hero's shadow team, started taking Sung Jin-woo by his clothes and saying that if he thinks he's wearing a school uniform while standing on the same field next to him, it means he's a weakling. And at that very second, all the shadow soldiers, Sung Jin-woo's generals, began to rejoice to see Iron return to them. Barayan started telling his master to trust him with this lost sheep, and he vows to re-educate him properly and make sure something like this doesn't happen again. But the guy, who was thought to be Iron, couldn't understand what was going on. Tears started to form on his face. Suddenly he fell to his knees and started to act and said, "Why is this happening to him?" And Sung Jin-woo, who started to withdraw, realized that he was now living as a human instead of a shadowy soldier. There's no need for him to get close to him. And in that same second, Iron realized that this feeling he had developed was called love. But Sung Jin-woo grimaced, for he couldn't understand what he had just said. And in that same second, Sung Jin-woo snapped his fingers. So, he started to tell him that he wanted to fight him, but then he suddenly found out that he purely happened to be the son of his brother and his sister's friend. They ended up splitting up, and in order to make sure that this didn't happen again, immediately afterward, Sung Jin-woo changed his memory. He started to step back and say that he was one of those who fought for this world, so he should be proud of himself. A little later, the middle school preliminaries were about to start. All the competitors were supposed to gather in the competitor area. But at that time, some man started to approach the house where Mrs. Selmer lived, and as soon as she opened the door, she saw Dave standing in front of her and was happy to see him. She asked him to come inside the house. As soon as they walked in, Dave smelled the delicious smell and realized that Mistress was probably eating lunch and he had come at a bad time. But she started to say that she was actually with another guest, in which case he decided to get straight to the point and leave her alone as soon as possible. Selner began to tell him that he was already aware that she could no longer see the future after the god of death arrived on this earth. As they began to sit down at the table, Mrs. Selner said she would answer his questions, and the answer to the first question was yes, and the answer to the second was no. But Dave couldn't understand how she knew. And she went on to answer that he wanted to ask her how she could know about his questions if she could no longer see the future. And as soon as she put the hot tea on the table, she started talking about how he is looking for answers to questions from the past, and she has turned to the past to give him a suitable answer. She knows who he wants to know about, but will not give out any information about this man named Dave. Was frustrated with this answer, he starts asking her to find out at least what this man was doing and if he could be a threat to their country. She says some unrelated situations, but decided not to say anything because she knows and started asking him a question. Didn't he see that video where the man stood against frightening monsters and giants without taking a step back and his strength was scary and incredible? And this time it saved humanity. The woman started to say that then he would believe her if she said it wasn't the first time. After all, there had been other similar cases in the past, which meant they were all on the verge of extinction themselves. Though I don't know, and Dave began to realize that maybe, just like the mistress said, this man had actually saved them. After a little conversation he started to leave the house and lastly he asked her what that man was filming and if she could claim that he wasn't a danger to them. To which she replied that yes she could, in which case the man understood and began to pretend like they had never spoken. Lastly Selner told him that she had baked cookies and he could try them, but he declined. After stroking the boy's head, he started to leave. And just as he started to leave the house and closed the door, Thomas Andre appeared. Otherwise, he says he doesn't like this old man and maybe he should teach him a lesson. But Selner starts telling Thomas that couldn't he be stripped of his athlete's license if he causes another incident. At home, with Andrew he decided to ask another question: why do accidents kill a lot of people, and not just him, especially car accidents? Countless people die in them almost every day. But because of her foresight he was able to survive, so he decided to ask why she saved him then. Well, she started to say because he had done a lot of good in his past life. Thomas Andre didn't realize it was about him. She says because he's a regular fighter who was dubbed as the UFC's lightning rod. That's Masa. I asked Mrs. Selner, what did that man in the video do, since such an important uncle came in? To which she replied that he saved the world on Thomasandra by smiling and eating cookies. He began to think that it was hard to understand this ladybike sometimes, whether she was joking or, on the contrary, telling the truth. He would never know. And he wondered what Mr. Hero, who had saved the world, was doing now. But Mrs. Selner didn't know that, and she had only riddles. Maybe he's all enjoying his youth somewhere. The preliminaries for the athletes and middle schoolers were about to begin and all participants had to gather at the gathering area. Once everyone was assembled, the championship preliminaries began, and the girls were in and ready to run. As soon as the start shot sounded, they shifted, and one of the girls started running with all her might, overtaking her competitors. The competition that started between the girls didn't last long, and a young girl named Cha, who was an amazing hunter in the past, was able to run to the finish line and came in first. As soon as the race was over, she sat down on one of the benches near the entrance of the sports complex and started to remove the sock on her right foot, and saw that her foot was still injured. She had somehow managed to make it through the first round, but she didn't know if she could run another race. She was furious about it. Suddenly, Sung Jin-woo started walking up to her and said that she wanted to hide her injury. When she turned around, she saw an unfamiliar guy who started talking to her. At first glance, she realized that he seemed to be an athlete and also a high school student. But Sung Jin-woo went on to say that if she ignored her injuries and ran, she would spend a year in a rehabilitation center and then become a terrible runner and regret her choice for the rest of her life, because he just knows such a person. Suddenly, the girl started to feel a pleasant odor and thanked Sung Jin-woo for taking care of her, saying that she would somehow manage on her own. But suddenly, her leg hurt again, and Sung Jin-woo moved even closer to her, telling her to bear with her for a second. But she didn't understand what he wanted to do, and as soon as she lowered her gaze, she saw, when his hand shone with a strange color, and the pain as well as the injury was gone, Sung Jin-woo started to tell her that she only had one chance, and she should run away without any unfortunately. But she didn't realize who this guy was and started asking him if they could have met somewhere before. And then she heard a condition from Sung Jin-woo to run. If she could outrun him, he would answer her those questions. She still continued to ask if he wasn't a high school student. After all, she had seen him win all the preliminary races he had only participated in. But Sung Jin-woo replied that she was wrong after all. The girl started to say that in that case, the entries for the preliminary competition would start soon and maybe he would tell her the truth when she went through them. Sung Jin-woo agreed, even though he realized that she was still young and mature, but she was still as sincere as she was back then. The championship story is over and they split up to go about their business. Soon our hero, who has experienced many different moments of life playing computer games with his friends, met that girl again. On the 15th, he had to study for his Korean exams. He was walking down the street one evening and realized that it was not boring for a person who had passed the unified exam. He was dressed in stylish clothes, and suddenly, in one of the store windows, he saw a coat that caught his eye. With the help of his magic, he took that coat. And after reflecting a bit, he began to run a report, and soon things began to unfold. Suddenly he turned and saw that she had already come in. But she wanted to scare him. "What, I'm in the back." And she started to say that he had eyes on the back of his head, and she started to ask him if he had passed the exam. If yes, she congratulated him and asked him if he would go to university. But as soon as he answered, she didn't understand why that was so. After all, he had a very high score, and why exactly was he going there? But he started to answer that there was a full scholarship and the opportunity to study abroad. Also, there is a person he wants to see there, but Girl Cha decided to ask that this person is not a woman, to which she heard the answer that who knows, maybe she is. So she started to get angry and asked Sung Jin-woo if he remembered their promise that he promised to answer all the questions if she wins the race. He couldn't figure out what she wanted to ask him as they competed to see who could run to the big Christmas tree first. But Sung Jin-woo was interested and heard her say that she wanted to ask him about things he sometimes thought about, as well as who he wanted to meet at the university and the time they met before the preliminaries. She then started to take off her scarf and gave it to Sung Jin-woo, saying that if he liked her, he should stay in that spot. He didn't realize what had happened and stood there like a dumbfounded man while she started running towards the Christmas tree in front of her. And at the same moment, the shadow soldiers started to appear and they started to tell their master that he lost. And they couldn't believe that their master could lose a bet to someone. But he stood there like a prick looking at the girl who was running away from him, and realized that he was seeing the same huntress he had met before in one of the dungeons, when she had come to his rescue to save her friend, and that time when they had flown on the amazing shadow dragon and sat in the forest and looked at the stars, and the last time they had talked on the phone, and he had promised her he would definitely meet her again. As soon as he finished these musings, he saw that she had made it to the Christmas tree and started shouting to him from afar that she had won. At the same time, he instructed his shadow soldiers who were hiding in the shadows to close their eyes. He then began to approach the Cha girl who was standing near the Christmas tree. As soon as he got even closer, he pulled her against him and kissed her. The next day, in the domain of eternal rest, one of the dragons greeted Mr. Fong, who stood and also said, "Good morning everyone." Every time I appeared in his path, he would say that. But in the shadow world, there was no separation between day and night. Suddenly he saw Marshall Bear walking toward him, and he began to tell him that it looked like the deed was done. Marshall pulled out a robe that looked just like the Lord's hoodie, and as soon as Fong withdrew from the misting, he started telling Marshall that he couldn't even imagine how he was going to pay for it. But Marshall couldn't ignore his desire to become like his Lord, and as long as he was happy, all was well. And as soon as Fong put on the robe, he started saying that he was really happy, and so much so that he was almost tempted by the idea of making wearing such a robe a duty for every soldier. The marshal, seeing this round red ball at the Fong's side, began to say that it might be better to turn the thing into a staff rather than carry it in his hand. To which the Fong agreed, for he realized that it was a great idea. And he began to ask the bearded man if the best artisan was considered, and if he could be trusted with his staff. To which the artisan behind him began to say that he could rely on him, and they would only welcome the opportunity to work with the sacred tree granted by their Lord, for their holdings were vast to be called infinite. On top of that, about 10 million soldiers lived there, helping each other and mentally connected to their Lord. As his powers grew, they too began to become like him. In other words, those who only wanted permission gradually adopted human qualities and various human emotions. The process of being filled with many new and diverse human feelings was quite a refreshing experience. There were both sleeping soldiers and soldiers practicing. Soldiers who were noisily chatting amongst themselves, and even those soldiers who were grabbing each other's pecs. They had an identity that made each of them live in this world differently, and they could endlessly express their gratitude to their Lord who showed them a new world they hadn't even imagined before. They liked their Lord very much, and suddenly Fong saw that his staff was ready and it looked very cool. The word cool seemed more appropriate for his robe than for this staff. "Oh my God!" the commander began to say to his subordinate, the taller orc. Suddenly the Fong saw some huge shadowy soldiers, and he didn't realize who they were. But they answered that Mr. Baron ordered them to come here. Fong realized that there seemed to be a couple of mage soldiers among the recruits. And it was a shame to shoot them with such size. So he decided to tell them in detail what he had achieved during the first battle against the terrifying enemy they called the Dragon Emperor, and then about all the achievements during the subsequent battle in the space between the two. But suddenly Fong's tale was interrupted by Commander-in-Chief Iris and began to tell Fong that things would soon begin, and hadn't they, the soldiers who served their lord, agreed to support him when the time came? So the two of them decided to look in interspace and saw that their lord would finally meet with Lady Cha. They were all excited for this amazing time that their lord had gone to so hard to get to. But Igris, who was looking at the young girl, began to think about the fact that the first time he met his lord was in an unconventional space that had been created by his lord's power. Well, the mission was to test the person who wanted to enter this place, and though his lord had said he wanted to find out if this person was suitable to be his vessel, he somehow already knew. He knew that this could be his master's last order, and then he began to guess that he would soon be saying goodbye to his master. When the master lost all interest in the war after forgiving the rulers, he realized that he had not just focused on some unremarkable man, and there was more to it than that. Nevertheless, he had to do his master's bidding. He had no thought of questioning his motives or trying to persuade him. It was all he could do. And so, after most of his powers were sealed away, he found himself alone in the place where this man's trial was taking place. The people of this world called such a space a dungeon, and Iris began to remember that he had a different species before he met his master, and like us, he didn't have infinite powers. This place made him think of himself, of being able to recreate the exact feeling as it was at that time, and of seeing that the architect was able to recreate that scene using the master's strength and careful planning. That man's body would constantly change to accept his master's power. And Iris remembered sitting on his throne and sensing the presence of this young man through the door. He was ready to meet him, for he had been awaiting his arrival. But suddenly he realized that it was too arrogant for him to sit like that, and he suddenly wondered. Would he not appear arrogant? After all, his master's consciousness was rooted in the man he would have to test and take the throne before him. This was a bit out of place, and he began to think about where he would go. And as soon as the door opened and the torches were lit, Igris stood behind the column. He wondered who he was, the one his master had chosen. And even if this mission hadn't been his last orders, he would never give him a head start. If he became convinced he was not worthy, he would kill him with his own hands. He was already ready to test this guy who walked into his domain, and decide if he was fit for the throne or not. And so their battle began, but the result was disappointing. However, he was only desperately trying to dodge his sword, having no talent or ability to crush it. However, he began to remember that he had decided to inflict damage through his armor, and that guy only had one way left. He was going to overpower him with his bare hands, and that was quite a manly take for a man. He liked that look, strong-willed, but Igris wondered if he matched it. After all, even if he was no match for his master, he would respect his will. When Iris was beating the still young son Jinwoo, he didn't understand how such a weakling could be a vessel for his master. So he kept beating him in the hope that he would give up, for he was not worthy of the place he sat in when he was too beaten. Iris decided to put him out of his torment and behead him for fighting honorably. For the first and last time he felt relieved at his lord's mistake. After all, if he proved unworthy to inherit his power, his master would stay with him for a while longer. And needless to say, Igris was stunned? Not by the fact that he had managed to block the swordplay, but by the fact that even in this situation, he had fought for his life until the very end. He couldn't believe that he would be so easily defeated by a man who was also much weaker than him. But suddenly, it was clear to him that even if it was only a fleeting glance, his eyes were able to remind him of the Lord, and they had a difference in ability. And since this was a test of his skills, he should have had a much higher score. But Igris still lost. It was because of his carelessness. He wondered that, or was it because of his persistence and unwillingness to give up? Having led to such a miracle, Igris was distraught and didn't know if he should be happy that his lord had made the right decision, and he himself lost in the following battles. His new overlord appreciated him, and on several occasions he was grateful for his kindness. To him he was a master, a friend and an associate, for he had fought many battles with him. And as his devotion to him grew, he noticed that the longing still for the Lord began to fade. Gradually he accepted the new Lord, and due to the addition of the Legion of Shadows waiting to be summoned, and the rifts of dimensions, the army became much stronger, and Barayan, his old comrade, joined as well. But the joy of the reunion simply passed. The Warjan began to be influenced by his loyal but fierce comrade. And when Barayan asked him what this black flag was, and whether the Lord would like it if he mounted it on top of the castle, it was easier when the barrier was beating the B'arc to a pulp, but the new master's reaction was amazing to the fact that they had put a black flag on that castle. And for that he punished them, and very soon their bravery was put to good use against the monarchs, and the master gradually improved in battle. Yes, and they became much stronger, and the battles continued even after the reversal of time with the Bowl of Reincarnation. And so it went on for about 30 years, all opponents were destroyed, only the Legion of Destruction remained. One day one of the monsters from the Legion began to tell Igris that it had once been a wing of the Legion of Shadows, but now obeyed the orders of a monarch who had never been mortal. Igris wondered if he should be ashamed of his past, but he realized that the monster was right and forgot about his past lord. The time spent with his new lord had been so wonderful that he had completely forgotten about the old one. He wondered at what point he began to forget about his previous lord. When he asked his new lord why he didn't tell the truth to him, he heard the reply that the knowledge of the ability to forget was a blessing of God to humans, even if it was an artificial result of God's tool. Igris realized that it was a blessing and there was no point in thinking too much about it, for he had not forgotten his past lord. Grit and iron, the timelines have crossed. Here had forgotten about everything and immersed himself in everyday life, but he was still by his lord's side. His feelings for him were connected to his current lord, and he was his lord's swordmaster, the wing that leads the Legion. When he wanted to help his lord in matters concerning the exams, for he was a graduate of the Knight Academy with the highest grade and was able to help his lord, he was willing to put his life on the line to get the answer in the exam correct. It was the second one. But when he read the answer, he was disappointed. And he decided that he still seemed to lack knowledge, but he would put more effort for his lord, for he was his lord's knight, his lord's ball. And after his lord's battle he realized that he had started a new battle. His glorious life would last a little longer. The gate is a huge portal that summons monsters to kill the dungeon boss. It is necessary to leave them within an hour. Our hero's father didn't make it in time, and he remained imprisoned in the rift between dimensions. While he was there, the rulers contacted him, and they trusted him with their power to stop the lords. Finally, the brightest particle of light gave him a new order to protect the Shadow Lord. That's why he helped him, but he didn't want to show his face like that. Because of that he started to ask for forgiveness from his son. After all, he missed him very much. He always wanted to see his son and how he had grown up. He wanted to talk a little longer and be close to him. It was hard for him because of his failure to be a good father. When time went back, our still little Shadow Lord woke up and saw his father. Tears started to run down his face. He thought he was having a terrible nightmare, but his father, looking at his still young son, began to smile. Suddenly, however, his face changed. He covered his face with a newspaper so that none of his family could see the tears that were streaming down his face. A little while later, he was sitting in one of the cafes talking to the ruler. He decided to ask the ruler what decision his son had made. The ruler answered him that the Lord of Shadows had decided to stay in this world, and he said that every second spent here was priceless to him. The Lord was gone, and the ruler asked if he would tell his son, for he would not wish anyone to remember the past. With his departure, the interference of the rulers would cease, for the affairs of this world were completely finished, and it was great. He couldn't even find something to do while he waited for the Shadow Lord's arrival and the news of his results, for the rulers wished to express their gratitude not only to him, but also to you, Mr. Huan. The ruler asked lastly if there was anything he could do for him, to which Jinwoo's father asked him, could he erase his memories? The ruler replied that there would be no difficulty in doing so, but he still wondered why he wanted to do it. Investor Huang started to say that it's hard for him to pretend with such an observant son. Also, he wants to be an ordinary father worrying about his child. And to him, Jinwoo is not a Shadow Lord, but a favorite son. And the ruler understood him and began to say that after leaving this cafe, he would not be able to remember the disappeared timeline. And though he would forget, the ruler began to say that he would pray for his peaceful future. At the same time, at the party that the guys from the athletes club had thrown, everyone was having a lot of fun. But Jinho, who was sitting far away, was getting very nervous and couldn't even get anything into his mouth. It was his first time at a welcome party, but what was the fun of it was that he sat at the table and realized that although he was the second son of a rather rich family, this pork ice cream restaurant was somehow more familiar to him. At the same moment, a guy came over to him and started telling Jinho to behave more cheerfully, because he didn't want anyone to see his face and think they wanted to eat him. That guy went on to say, it's Jinho to calm down. After all, they are not some old dorks, and he should be with him when someone is near him. But he should be more careful with the others just in case, because they also have one scarecrow, and he is not so harsh with the younger ones, just his charisma is not particularly pleasant. But Jinho was not upset. After all, no one can compare to his father. Suddenly, while they were talking, Jinwoo started walking over to them. The guy who was sitting next to Jinho didn't understand why no one was sitting at their table, so he decided to sit with the cuties who were sitting at the next table. And just as Jinwoo decided to sit at Jinho's table, the guy who was sitting next to him started to leave, saying that he would go and watch the others. Jinwoo immediately took a glass and offered Jinho a drink. He took the glass with his hands without a second thought and drank it to the last drop, even though he realized he had a drinking problem. Jinwoo took the bottle and poured a second shot, saying that he would drink with him today. But Jinho didn't understand what was happening now, but at some point he started to realize that he had seen this situation somewhere before. The next day, Jinwoo was walking down the street and started calling his friend Janho to tell him that he had some very important things to do today. He has something important to do and he has to be at the last lecture for him. But Jinho started yelling back at him that most of the faculty knew him and how he could replace him and where he was even. Jinwoo answered him that he is in practice at the university hospital. But Jinho started to shout, what does that mean? Because the hospital is not related to their direction. But Jinwoo immediately hung up the phone and told him that she believed in him. At the same moment, there was a girl walking along who was thinking about whether or not to enroll in the All University. After all, it's certainly great, but she wasn't happy with her Busan accent, and in her native language she couldn't just talk about medical direction, for some reason a bunch of English is used. And at the same moment, Jinwoo and Miss Cha bumped into each other, and she asked for an apology. Suddenly she asked if they could meet somewhere. To which he turned his head and said no. And as soon as Miss Cha stepped a little further away, she realized that she had done something stupid. For why she had started talking to a stranger out of the blue and began to think that maybe he thought she was up to something or in her premeditation was trying to recruit him. And at the same time in the hospital where Jinwoo was going, the doctor who was entering the room started to approach his patient. And just as he started to lift up his chairman, the doctor saw some old vial. I started asking the chairman what it was. To which he replied that a young man had recently visited him and it was from him. Although it was mysterious that someone had entered his ward, because the ward is constantly guarded, and he was able to leave it here unnoticed by everyone. But what this young man had told him was even more incredible, that it had helped him fight monsters in a timeline that had already disappeared. This vial was a gift as a token of gratitude for the past. Then he simply vanished like a shadow, as if he didn't exist at all. And the young man said that his non-spirit would be instantly cured if he drank it. But the doctor was sure that the chairman should not believe such talk. However, the chairman began to say that he was very tired and began to ask the doctor that if he didn't even drink it, anyway, how long would he have left if something happened to him? The doctor should write the following on his gravestone: the chairman held out to the last toss with the disease and now rests in peace. As soon as he opened the vial and drank it, he put it back on the table. After that he lay down on his bed and said he wanted to get some rest. The doctor started to say that if he needed anything he should let him know immediately. As soon as the doctor left the room, the chairman, who was lying on the hospital bed, began to feel something strange as he looked out the window at the clouds. He saw a bright light coming through the windows in his room, and suddenly his illnesses began to disappear. His name was Antares, and he was the first lord born out of darkness. He was also called the strongest lord and king who ruled over dragons, a symbol of terror and destruction. This was true, and anyone who knew him called him the Dragon Emperor as a sign of respect and admiration. One day, while in the space between dimensions with his 10 million man army and preparing to invade planet Earth, a moment later he found himself in a human body. He looked in the mirror and couldn't understand why he was in a human body. His name was now Sun Jinwoo, and he was a young man working as a rank 10 hunter in South Korea. Even though he had a pitiful level of ability that often put him in a deadly position, he was unwilling to give up the life of a hunter. He was driven by his mother's illness, and such an illness could be cured instantly with his magic. But suddenly he saw his phone begin to ring. As soon as he picked up the phone and asked who is it, he heard them start telling him that it was already time for him to go on the raid, but he still hadn't arrived. Why was he late again? Late was a failure to meet the promised time frame due to failure to arrive on time. So, this woman had just dared to tell him, the mighty Dragon Emperor, that he would do something that would be a sign of his worthlessness, and that was simply unacceptable. Immediately afterward, he started asking where she was now, to which she replied, "What do you mean, where is she now?" "Right in front of the gate." She wondered why he had changed his tone so drastically. The dragon ruler began to concentrate, for he wanted to find out the exact location of where this cheeky girl was speaking from. Suddenly he found her and was at her back in a second, saying in a terrifying tone that he was still late and she could tell him to his face if he was late. To which she freaked out really badly and started saying that no, he was right on time. He started to head towards a coffee shop that was nearby, but suddenly some man started calling him and he didn't realize who the guy was. Maybe he was his subordinate, but it didn't matter. So he went on and told the man who was sitting there making coffee that he wouldn't mind having coffee too. To which the man started to say that he was sorry, but the coffee had just run out. But Antares snatched his own coffee out of his hands and said that it was no problem, for those with power lock up what the weak possess. This approach of the lords who were standing around didn't understand what was going on with Jinwoo. After all, he looked a little strange today, and his eyes had changed. From the moment he appeared, he could sense something very creepy and frightening from him. And at the same moment, the girl who was the healer in this raid came over and started talking in Jinwoo's body. Why is he wearing bandages again, and did he hurt himself again? But Antares didn't understand why the people here were so noisy. And at the same moment, one of the hunters started to say that although he wasn't in a position to say this, as they were going to raise money joyfully today, he's still going to lead them as the leader of the group, and if anyone had an objection, most of the hunters were only in favor of having him in charge. Antares, who was standing nearby in Jinwoo's body, realized that this place was quite suspicious. And once all the hunters started to embark on this raid and enter the Antares gate, looking at this gate that appeared on Earth was no doubt a trick of the Lord's, but he wondered why he could sense the Lord's aura from there. He decided to find out what was lurking there. None of the hunters that second started telling him to be careful not to hurt himself behind their backs. Antares realized that this was a very loyal subordinate since he cared so much about his leader being a weakling. And once they all entered the gate and the enemy inside, Antares fought the monsters with his terrifying strength, tearing them to pieces. All the hunters who were standing behind looked at Jinwoo and realized that he was acting the strangest possible today. They decided that perhaps the dungeon was too strong, and at one point, they didn't realize that their eyes weren't keeping up with the movement. And once Antares had dispersed all the monsters that were in that part of the dungeon, he started to say, "Why is everyone standing around and looking around? We need to move on." But the leader, who was considered to be the eldest, started to say for everyone to wait, because they need to vote to decide such matters. In the same second, Antares hit him on the back of the head with a very swift movement, which made him start to fall to the ground and lose consciousness. After he slew the leader, he started to say to the rest of the guys, "Anyone else want to vote?" But that group of hunters with already blue signs started to step aside and say that no, they didn't start moving further down the dungeon. It had been about 40 minutes and they were realizing that the dungeon should close in an hour after defeating the boss, which was about 20 minutes left. At one point, they reached the door that closed this tunnel. It was the first time they had seen such large doors, and some of the hunters thought that it was too dangerous. However, Antares, who was standing nearby, realized that they all seemed to be very afraid. Although he was in agreement with them, he too could feel a terrifying aura emanating from within. He started to open the door and grabbed one of the hunters by his clothes, deciding to throw him inside this room, though he didn't realize why he did it. Suddenly he realized that it didn't seem like anything scary was going on, so it was okay to go inside. As soon as they stepped inside, all the torches started to light up. Some of the hunters were encountering such a dungeon for the first time and decided to split up to look around the place. And at some point some of them noticed a huge statue and they started to fear it and hope it wasn't the boss. Antares showed the rest of the hunters a tablet that was scribbled with runes, but the rest of the hunters couldn't read what was written there. Though Antares realized this was foolish, he himself began to read what was written there. And there were the laws of the Temple of Cardinan. He was pulled by his clothes, and the healer girl began to tell him to look at the statue of the god that stood nearby. But Antares said to her, "Why the hell is she touching it?" and proceeded to read the tablet on which it was written, "You have laws, and the first is to worship God, the second is to praise God, and the third is to prove your piety. And he who does not observe these laws will not leave this place alive." Immediately after he recited these laws, the large statue that stood behind them began to turn in their direction. Fiery lasers began to appear from its eyes. But Antares didn't want to wait and immediately threw himself at her with words that she dared to underestimate him with such a pitiful strength. And as soon as the statue started to ignite, Interest took all the fire attack. It should have been very strong, but in response, he started using his breath of destruction and struck back at that big statue. He says here's the real power, and in that same second all the other statues that were in that room started to come to life, move and walk towards all the hunters. Running towards all the hunters, but Antares in response started running towards them and saying what a bunch of arrogant puppets they were. In an instant he started cracking them, smashing them and burning them, and all the hunters who started running away from there didn't understand why they came here and what kind of place this was with such laws. After a few minutes Antares was standing near all the statues that had been smashed and started yelling that this was all they could do, because he hadn't even prostrated himself. And then the last of the statues woke up and started telling Antares who he was and how he dared to destroy what she had worked so hard for. But Antares didn't want to listen to him and at that very second ordered him to shut up and threw a spear at him, which began to pierce his stone shell. Andreas started to say that he didn't come here to chat with a fake, and he deserved to meet the personality behind it all, and he should show the trope that was hiding behind all those statues. At the same moment, a dark energy began to appear that took control of the large statue, and a terrifying dark sound began to reach Antares. It seemed that the ruler of destruction was destined to meet like this, and here in this place, he would put an end to their ill-fated relationship. But Antares was already prepared for battle and began to say that this was a great idea, and their battle would not just end. As soon as they faced each other, Jinwoo began to wake up from having some kind of scary dream. He sat on his bed and couldn't realize what the dream was. In fact, he couldn't believe it because he saw all the shadowy soldiers who started to look out also didn't understand why their master was in such a state, which he learned when he joined the detective team this year. He worked within the ranks of the Central Region Violent Crimes Unit and was known as the detective nicknamed Ghost. He easily solved every, even the most complex case that came his way. In addition, he often took on unsolved crimes from the past. The arrest rates of this Ghost were 200% higher, and it was said that any violent criminal turned into a cute and fluffy sheep in the face of Ghost. He was already a legend to the local police department, and newcomer Huang, who had recently entered the police academy, began to reflect on what was also being said about him. He had heard that Ghost had turned down a promotion in favor of working crime scenes. Suddenly, the chief investigator of the precinct started walking up to him and said that he was the rookie who had joined their department. Wong turned around and said that was correct. The chief investigator started telling him not to take it so seriously and not to stick to formalities. After all, they were now one family, and offered him a cup of coffee. Huang started to say that he talked to the squad captain today and he told him that he would now be working with Detective Sung Jinwoo. As of today, the squad captain had questioned him about what he meant about ghost, because they decided to call him that because he kept appearing and disappearing like a ghost. Now even people from other departments call him that, and he's sure he's heard of him too. In fact, the coffee he gave him was for Sun Jinwoo, and at that very moment, they started to turn around, because Sun Jinwoo was at their backs. He started walking up to those guys and asking who this guy was his rookie, and he offered that he would train him as a rookie. They started walking away together. Just as they stepped away, the rookie started to worry that Sung Jinwoo wouldn't get mad at him for drinking his coffee and decided to find out where they were going. But Sung Jinwoo hugged him and started asking him why he decided to become a police officer. To which he heard the answer that he wanted to catch bad guys, and Sung Jinwoo said that was right. After all, that's what they're going to do now, since he became a cop for the same reason. And here the rookie couldn't believe that he would be catching criminals with the ghost himself. A few days later, in the criminal investigation department, the guys in the department were wondering why the newcomer came back so tired and probably spent the whole day catching petty criminals with investigator Sung Jinwoo. And so, at this time, Sung Jinwoo was sitting at his computer and trying to go about his routine business. One of his assistants, let's call him Shadow Soldier, approached him and offered to take over his routine tasks. He claimed that they were loyal assistants and were always willing to help. Suddenly, from a distance, a girl started yelling at the detective to listen to her. She claimed that Jen was not the kind of girl who would commit suicide. The detective responded by saying that he understood her feelings and had already figured everything out in detail. He claimed that everything pointed to the fact that she had done everything of her own free will. However, the girl didn't stop screaming and told the detective to read some of the messages where it seemed she was planning to commit suicide in 3 hours. The detective replied that most suicides are committed spontaneously under the influence of emotion and not planned in advance. It was at this point that Sung Jinwoo came up to them and asked the detective if he minded reviewing the case. He began to read that the woman was found in the bathtub bleeding profusely from her wrist, and the knife used to do it was found in the bathroom. It only had her fingerprints on it. The case also stated that the deceased looked like a bright personality but actually suffered from depression. So Sung Jinwoo started working on the case together with the investigator. Once Sung Jinwoo finished reading, he said that he didn't see any mistakes. But still, he decided to check everything himself just in case, if they could step back and talk normally. When night came, Sung Jinwoo showed up at the apartment where the suicide happened. He started looking around and saw that the apartment was very cozy and everything was cleaned up. But everything he was interested in was in the bathroom. That very bathroom was where that unsolved case was committed, and he began to see that there was still some dark energy left in the bathroom. Although he realized that he only wanted the remains before, he was now much stronger than before and began to tell that girl to rise from the dead. Suddenly, she began to appear in the form of a shadowy soldier. Once she fully appeared, he began to tell her not to be afraid, for she was now a being beyond life and pain. He began to ask her if she intended to kill herself, to which he heard the answer that she did, but he was interested in the question, why did she do it? As soon as she started talking, she told him everything in detail. And that same evening, in one of the rooms of the apartment, the man, who was in his apartment, heard the doorbell ring. He was wondering who had come at such a late hour. As soon as he looked at the camera, he saw a detective standing outside the door. And the detective started telling him that he had some questions about his daughter's death and if he could talk to him a little bit. As soon as he opened the door, he started to get nervous and said that he had completed the investigation. He's now wondering how his little daughter died, but Sung Jinwoo said that nothing is definite. However, he had a few questions he wanted to ask him about his daughter and if he could go along with him. That girl's father agreed and started saying that if he could help in any way to find the truth about his daughter's death, he would cooperate fully. And at a nearby cafe, they began to take a seat at a table. Sung Jinwoo started to ask him which disciple was usually his daughter. But the father of the deceased daughter didn't understand what he meant. So Sung Jinwoo asked again, perhaps there was someone who held a grudge against her. But she definitely didn't have any enemies, and she was completely innocent. At the same moment, he started flying and said that his little girl had left him. Just like that, Sung Jinwoo asked that he must have treasured his daughter. The man with the link in his eyes started to say that they probably already knew, but his daughter was not his biological daughter. And that's why he treasured and loved her as much as if she was his real child, maybe even more. If she had only told him that she was hurting, that she couldn't cope anymore, he would have helped her. But Sung Jinwoo interrupted his story, put the phone down on the table, and began to say that when they were going through his daughter's personal belongings, they had discovered a certain sound file and he should listen to it. As soon as the recording went on, the man started crying even more. I witnessed the horrific abuse she endured with her foster father when she was a young child. Although she managed to escape to another region, when her foster father contacted her and said he wanted to see her again, she decided to take her own life. After this man listened to the tape, his tears disappeared and he started talking with a serious face, asking the detective why he had included the tape to him. Sung Jinwoo explained that he had two options. The first was to confess his wrongdoing and go to the station with him to confess everything. The second was to pay a certain price. The man, upon hearing this, became hopeful of getting out of this story and asked how much he should pay. However, Sung Jinwoo smiled and said that it was already enough. The man started crying even more. With a serious face, the detective began to speak to be listened to carefully. In fact, he was now in another world, which he had altered slightly to resemble the real world, but it was the land of death, on which no living soul could set foot without the permission of its master. For it is the domain of eternal rest, and from this moment on they would become, in effect, prisoners. But that man didn't understand what the detective was talking about. Sung Jinwoo asked him how he got here, and he began to narrate how things could have turned out. There was no one in the brightly lit cafe besides him and that mysterious detective. And the man started yelling, "Who the hell is he? I mean, this is some kind of nightmare. He's dreaming and he's about to wake up." And just as he began to run away, the shadow of that girl began to chase him. In just a few seconds, the shadow massacred that man, causing him to scream so loudly that he would have been heard in the nearest neighborhood. But in this world, no one could hear him. 12-1212. As soon as those had straightened him out, she flew up to her master and thanked him for being able to let her get her revenge. Sung Jinwoo asked her if she had anything she wanted to say goodbye, and she started to say that if it wouldn't bother him, could she ask for a small favor? The next day at the police station, Sung Jinwoo handed the box to the friend of that murdered girl and began to tell her that her friend's name was contained in the letter, and he thought that Ms. Jen would want this gift to find its recipient. From the circumstantial indications, the likelihood of murder was extremely slim and the investigation would soon be over. That girl didn't understand if there wasn't even a 1% chance that it was something else. And as soon as she started to open the box, she saw something in it that made her cry. And she said, "Thank you, Detective Sung Jinwoo." And as he started to back away, he thought about the fact that if that nasty message from her foster father hadn't arrived on her phone an hour before Jin's death, those girlfriends would have enjoyed the birthday party as planned. The next day, Jinwoo met with his friend Jin Ho, who with a serious face started saying that this time he will definitely propose to Miss Jin Ah. Today, he was very serious and started to ask Jinwoo how he thought she would like the ring he started to show her. But Jinwoo replied that he doesn't know, because he doesn't know much about such matters. Jin Ho honestly admitted that he didn't know what she would like, so he prepared some gifts. His company is planning to build a new building, so they could build a hospital. Suddenly, Jinwoo interrupted him and started asking him what the estimated cost of the building was if it cost 30 million won. But Jin Ho didn't understand how he knew. All of this is because in his past life, Jinwoo had told the man that Eugene had offered him a building project worth 30 billion, and if he was offering more than that, then the White Tiger Guild had around 5 to 10 million. Jinwoo wondered what the reason was that everything was repeating itself. He started telling Jin Ho that he doesn't need to overwhelm her with gifts to impress her, because he's already a good guy. It's enough for him to just be himself. But after saying that, Jin Ho started sobbing and asking if he could hug his mentor. And across the table, he started flying to Jinwoo and hugging him, and all the food that was on the table started collapsing on the floor. As soon as evening came, Jinwoo started to go back home. When he walked into the house, he was greeted by his wife and young son. She started to ask him why he had to go out drinking when he wasn't even intoxicated. But Jinwoo started to say that his friend Jin Ho wanted to tell him some important news, so he went to meet him. His wife, Cha, realized that Jin-ho had finally decided to confess to her and propose. Jin-ho immediately took his son Soho in his arms and began to notice that he was particularly energetic even though it was night outside. Cha first said that he slept a lot during the day, but at that very second, the shadow soldiers appeared and started arguing amongst themselves about why they shouldn't teach young Master Suho the way of the sword if he even realized the pointlessness of his statement. But Igris insisted, for he knew that high academic performance was the key to success in this world. Jinwoo asked them to calm down, for he was not against either swordsmanship or academics, but they would discuss it after the boy learned to walk. Our hero's wife began to ask how he liked the idea of coming home early until he learned to walk. The next day morning, Jinwoo came to work at the police station and began to enter the chief's office, for he had called him in advance, and he started to say that he heard that he was still interfering in the investigation of other investigators and asked that he not be forced to go too far so that there would be no complaints against him. Hunter Jinwoo said he is no longer a hunter and prefers to be addressed simply as Jinwoo. He is aware that the suicide victim girl's father went missing a few days ago. Jinwoo says that he didn't go off course, but Jin-chul starts talking about how coincidentally all the security cameras around his house stopped working when Jinwoo came to see him. However, Jinwoo thinks it's just a coincidence. Jin-chul gave him a note and told him whatever he decided to do and that he believes in his success, but he didn't call him here for that. He then started talking about what he wanted to know about it and said that the chairman, or rather now the president, is in critical condition. A few minutes later, Jinwoo found the chairman lying on the ward and hooked up to a life support machine. The chairman began to wake up, and upon seeing Jinwoo in front of him, immediately pointed to his mask. Jinwoo understood his wish and helped him remove his mask. The chairman expressed his joy to see Jinwoo and said that he had been looking for him all this time. However, Jinwoo interrupted him by suggesting that he take medicine to cure his illness. To which the chairman replied that he had already lived a long life and had done everything he needed to do in the past 10 years that Jinwoo had given him. He felt that was enough. The chairman then began to talk about his request to Jinwoo, remembering that they had previously fought side by side in another world. He wished he could learn more about the world and find out how things really were there. He wished he could remember what he looked like back then, but Jinwoo started to say that it might not be something that would be pleasant to remember. However, the chairwoman decided that it was no big deal since he only wanted to bring back lost memories. At that very second, Jinwoo touched the chairwoman's hand with his finger and thus decided to show him what he was asking for the moment when they met. Note, this text remains unclear and uncontextualized, possibly due to a loss of connection in translation or missing part of the context. If you have clearer wording or additional explanations, I can try to help more accurately. The story is about an island that the chairman asked him to protect all the hunters who went to fight huge ants. The raid on the island ended, and the meeting with the ruler, from which hands he then died, was the last moment of his life. He was like a shard of the brightest particle of light. When he remembered it all, tears began to flow, and he whispered that he never thought he would be able to remember it all again. And now he feels real again, as he and similar young heroes like Jinwoo are enveloped in warm sunlight. Even if he goes to the other world, the glory encased in his memory will be eternal and warming. In the end, the chairman let out his last breath, and Jinwoo, who had sat with him until his last breath, said one last time that he was also a hero who had sacrificed so much for others. Not long after Jinwoo got out of the hospital, his wife called him and started telling him that their son was flying all over the kitchen. But Jinwoo didn't understand what to do in this situation and reassured his wife, saying that everything would be fine. He assured her that he would now learn how to sovereignly handle flying. However, Jinwoo forgot to inform his wife that he himself had the ability to fly. When fall came, winter followed, and after winter came spring. Everything has a beginning and an end, and every end is a new beginning. It seems that winter had not yet come for them. And at the time, the queen of the ants said that since there was no food, let the ants eat other ants, and there was no more food in the land to feed the inhabitants and the book of the kingdom. And she knew that this could not go on forever, for their people needed a strong soldier who, for the good of the kingdom, should make all enemies standing in their way tremble with fear. And that's how he was born, to kill all living things in his path and all living things that look at him with fear in their eyes. And that's when he first met that hunter. The one who was not afraid of him, and it had been a long time since then, began to tell the little child dryly to come forth a man who was not afraid of him. He started to walk away, but the child still followed him and wouldn't stop yelling ant 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 ant, let's play. But Bear flew away, and it was strange to him why his young lord was always looking for him. At the same second, the Iris-in-Chief appeared and started saying that because he wasn't disgusted with him, ants, which are much bigger than humans and can also walk and fly and talk, might like some kid because of their features, and that's why the young lord likes him. When Marshall returned to the netherworld, he started talking about wanting to change the plan a bit. The engineer wanted to slightly change the stats of their lord's sacred statue. However, the engineer explained to him that the plan for the statue was made months ago to celebrate his 32nd birthday. Marshall Bear began to say that he didn't want to cancel anything, only to make some changes. When he expressed his wishes, the engineer said that they could fulfill his request, but they would need more people than they currently had. And that might be possible if they brought in demons from the demon castle created by the architect. After Bara agreed, he said he would settle some matters first as he sensed someone approaching his lord's house. It turned out to be 3 robbers, and one of them mentioned the Jinwoo organization, which had collapsed due to the actions of a certain scumbag. They decided to take revenge on the policeman, holding him responsible for the destruction of their organization. Upon arriving at the burglar's house, they discovered that it was huge and wondered if there was a security system. As they jumped over the fence, they encountered a shadow that seemed to be part of the security system. It was Marshall Bear, who grabbed one of the bandits and began to speak. The Overlord has just fallen asleep, and should not be disturbed by uninvited guests. Such a familiar look, such a familiar feeling of trust in their lord, and the young lord's favor, that's great, of course. However, this arrangement is not bad either. Prey always behaves this way in front of a predator. Those were Marshall's last words before he dealt with those uninvited guests. And a little while later, Marshall was looking at the statue that all the engineers and builders had finished making. The engineer began to say that they had done everything according to his instructions, pointing to the large statue on which Jinwoo stood with his dagger drawn and holding his son. The marshal assumed that if in the distant future the young overlord could step into this place, it would be a truly meaningful gift to him. But suddenly, Ber realized that the young lord was already standing behind him. And in that same second, he became frightened, for he didn't realize how he had gotten here. A few years later, Jinwoo's wife was sitting in a chair, and a teacher came up to her to show her a picture her son had drawn. She didn't understand what was wrong with the drawing, but that girl started to explain that the class teacher had asked her to draw something in a friend's sketchbook, and that very second she realized that the drawing showed an ant standing on 2 legs. There were a few more drawings on the back, and my son drew dryly when asked if he had any other friends. On the next page he drew his idea of a family, and on the last page he drew his house. Actually, that's why they asked to meet with her today, and so far they have taken care of many children, but this is the first time they have seen a child describe his friends and family in this way. When the teacher asked what he drew on the bottom of the house, the son said it was his friends, family and Big Daddy. At first glance, it all seemed like the aftermath of domestic violence. But Suho, who was literally glowing here, was indicating that maybe there was a huge potential in art in him. At the same time, all the guys at the police station started congratulating Jinwoo and telling him, "Why don't you get famous? Why didn't you refuse the promotion this time? After all, you've gone against your superiors every time before." But he replied that this time he had run out of excuses for refusing. His subordinate began to ask if he didn't want anything. Didn't he want a higher position or more money? And Jinwoo wondered if he should believe that he was earning as much as a huge law firm, being even younger than him. When he returned home, he asked his wife to show him a drawing that their son had drawn. Jinwoo was surprised. After all, he is only 5 years old, but he had already drawn ants so well. His wife started to say that his son said that it was a Big Daddy inside a dark dungeon, and it reminded him of something. But Jinwoo began to laugh, for he remembered something funny. She went on to say that she thought the other kids were afraid of Suho, and all mistakes pale as soon as Suho approaches them. After all, he's never even offended them or raised his voice. This is most likely because the feeling of children is much purer than adults. They probably felt the power of the Overlord dryly and avoided him because they felt the aura of death emanating from him. This power belongs to him alone and will not bring disaster. In reality, it could be a being hidden inside his most dedicated warrior and destined to destroy everything that was not created. If the powers of the Shadow Ruler, which he did not plan to pass on to his son, continue to grow, then he would not be able to live a normal life. Jinwoo began to think about restricting Dry's powers to an age where he could control them perfectly. Until Dry became part of society, his power and memory of Shadow Soldiers would temporarily have to be sealed. And just as he was about to do so, Marshal Ber appeared and began to ask his master if he could ask for parting words for the young overlord. While Dry asleep, he began to say that he bade him farewell on behalf of all the shadow soldiers, and it was an honor to serve him, the young overlord. He will pray for her well-being until they meet again. Her sovereign will follow the schedule even in her absence. And lastly wished for the young overlord's well-being, and Jinwoo began to use his power. And by doing so, stripped his son of the memories of all those shadow soldiers he had met before. Many years had passed since then, and he had already grown up and become an adult. The story began in high school, where the world turned out to be a whole new class and new classmates. Everything could be understood at a glance, who would become a friend and who would be a servant. Some guys assumed that the hierarchy in the class would be roughly like this. However, the problem was the other guy. That guy who was talking to the girl started paying attention to the guys in the back rows who were looking in his direction strangely. One of the classmates approached those guys and told them that they were in the same school and they better not hit on that guy. The bully then started asking that guy why he touched him and if he wanted trouble. A little while later, when classes were over, those three guys started beating up their classmate who had interfered in their conversation. Those guys had heard that he was supposedly a local celebrity, but turned out not to be as strong as one would think, and started asking him why he was so eager to defend him. The beat-up guy started saying that he was the strongest in his middle school and they couldn't even touch him. Eventually, everyone backed off because they realized this could end badly. And after saying that, they proceeded to beat him up. For they thought it was unpleasant to hear him say that. They thought that he had decided to play a prank on them, and if it was true after all, why were there no rumors about him? And at the same time, dryly responding to the closest guys who beat up his friend is interfering. That would be like self-defense. And at the same second, Dry flew up and kicked one of the guys in the stomach with his foot, causing him to start flying off to the side. And in that same second, he hit the other guy with his foot as well. That left the last opponent who started to attack Dryly, but he dodged. At one point he threw a powerful punch and sent the third guy into a knockout. The punch was so strong that the guy flew up in the air and started to pass out right as he flew. And they all lay passed out on earth, and Dry started telling that guy who was beaten up that since that was what happened, he would protect him at this school too. That guy realized that it wasn't a bad deal for him, and soon after that some of the students found out about Dry dealing with those bullies. It wasn't surprising to them, because when they first met him they didn't think they saw any strange aura from him and heard that he was pretty famous in his neighborhood because he had been practicing judo from an early age. But Dry when he started walking out of class after the last lesson and something seemed to him. At one point he got really bored and the fact that he used to have more of something in his life that made his heart beat faster, he decided that maybe now an internet cafe would help him have some fun. But suddenly, when he started to open the door, it wouldn't open. And as soon as he got to the window, he saw that time had stopped, but he couldn't see if that was even possible. And suddenly he started to see a portal that was opening right in front of him in this classroom. He didn't understand what it all meant and what he should do in such a situation. After all, his mom had said that he looked like his father, and he began to think about what his father would do at this moment. As soon as he tossed his briefcase aside, he began to step inside the portal. He saw a long corridor and didn't realize what this place was. Suddenly that portal began to disappear behind him and he realized there was no turning back. Now there was nothing left for him to do but to keep going forward. He picked up the torch that was on the wall and began to look around the endless corridor that had no end. As soon as he touched the wall, he saw a weapon that was attached to the wall, and he didn't understand, did he really get into the game, because he wanted to go to the internet cafe, but he found himself here. He realized that he had to choose a weapon from the assortment that was offered to him. There was a gear level type system, and he could get something better if he pumped up. But suddenly he saw a strange dagger and realized that this rack displayed everything that could be described as junk. He wondered why anyone would want to use such an unsightly weapon. Suddenly he saw the wristbands that hung on the wall. That was fine for him, as swords were too uncomfortable, so he decided to settle on the wristbands. Soho started walking down the corridor and noticed that he had gotten into some sort of basement of a large castle. At one point, as he passed the large knights, he felt one of them start to attack him, but he managed to cross his arms and block his blow. As soon as the knight's sword reached its target, there was a loud clang, and that knight began to fly aside. Following that, Dryly began to attack him, and eventually, he was able to destroy them, and in that second, his level was raised. He realized that these things that were standing could move, and at that same moment, he noticed that on his way over, he saw so many creatures just like him. As soon as he turned his head, he saw many knights surrounding him. He realized that everything was just as he thought, and this battle was still going on for a long time. Her level kept increasing and increasing, but the number of knights coming at him didn't decrease, and he continued to fight against them with all his might even though there were even more of them. He crushed them one by one. Once his current level reached 19, he realized that his level increases if he defeats those armor-clad monsters. Then he becomes much stronger, and it really feels like a game. Once he destroyed all those monsters, he realized that it wasn't an easy start. But now he can handle them even if they attack him in groups, even though those creatures are stronger than him. He began to wonder how he was able to defeat them while being at level 1, but it was probably because of the power he had mastered, but he didn't realize where that power came from, and he wanted to become even stronger. As soon as he got to the door, he started to open it, and behind the door he saw a guard sitting at his throne, in the distance. He realized it was the boss, and the one looked pretty strong. As soon as the boss started to draw his huge sword, Soho decided that he needed to strike first. But just as he was about to fight, the boss was already beside him and was able to straighten him out in a split second. He didn't understand how this could happen, but suddenly it was as if he was reborn and reappeared in the same corridor where he started. He started to look at his hands and didn't realize what it was, but he ended up in one piece. But as soon as he turned around he saw the same spot and realized that he was back at the beginning, for he thought he was going to die. But soon he began to wonder if he should go through the hallway, and he was sure that all three had spoken before. Or maybe it was just a coincidence. But he soon realized that it didn't seem like a normal coincidence. Since he had leveled up, he decided to change his weapons and put on gloves that were much more durable than his previous ones. He decided that he had to be careful and didn't want to know what would happen after all three flames went out. After all, he guessed they were his lives. But after a while he failed to prevail again, and he had one last factor left to burn alone. He decided to fall to the ground and spin around, for he was too angry and realized that that Black Knight was too strong for him. He didn't realize that he was upsetting the balance of this game he was in. He knew it was a total desperation play. He would never defeat this boss. But suddenly he saw the sword on the wall and realized that this weapon only belongs to the boss, and if that guy has the original, it's superior. Decided it would be better to go up a few levels before going there again. This time he would be extremely cautious and decided to fight those knights who were constantly revived. This time, they wouldn't appear indefinitely. He started fighting monsters, and after a while, his level rose higher and higher. Soon, he was much stronger than he was before. The last system notification showed that the player had reached the required level, and the survival class became available. Once he accepted it, the notification showed that the longer he lasted, the more points he would collect needed to advance to the next class. Huge monsters began to emerge from the portals, but Soho was glad he hadn't brought his watch with him, for he didn't need the time now, and the timer ticking above him let him know that there was enough time. He defeated all those knights in his path, for mages appeared and started attacking him with fire, but he was able to dodge their attacks. And as soon as he turned around, he saw that they started summoning a huge fire over his head. But he was able to react in time and protect himself from that fire with his shield. And as soon as the fire stopped, he noticed that these mages started to think of something again. As soon as they finished their sorcery, a huge knight appeared in front of them. He sighed heavily and threw his shield aside, realizing that they could not worry about it now. And as soon as that big knight started attacking him, dryly drew his sword and destroyed him, and soon after that, he started destroying the other knights that were advancing. He cut down all those creatures that ran at him. He then started using all the weapons he could bring with him and also used his bow, which he used to shoot and hit the target. After that, he pulled out the blades he had behind his back and cut all the knights that were nearby. Once he dealt with them, he started fighting using his gauntlets, realizing that he didn't need anything at all and that men should be fists. Promoted again, and soon, once he had dealt with all the knights, the notification window showed that he needed advancement points to advance through the class system, and the appropriate class would be assigned to the player based on an analysis of his achievements and morale. After overcoming all adversity and marching towards his goal without fearing difficulties and believing in his own strength, he was offered the class fighter and was able to advance in his system, earning advancement points. And once he surpassed the projected length of the game, additional points were added to him. Because he destroyed all of his opponents, he was also added extra points. Once again advancing, the sum of the advancement points he gained exceeded the limit, and the class was changed from fighter to soul fighter. But he realized that it was still not enough to convince the boss, and he needed to become even stronger. Continuing to fight, he soon obtained a sentinel pendant and an excellent mage ring, and the scorching gauntlets of a battle ghost. At this moment, he realized that he was now ready to fight the boss who was waiting for him, and as soon as he came out of the portal, he started telling the boss of this dungeon that he must have been waiting and now it was his turn to fight at full strength. But this dungeon boss didn't want to wait and started attacking him with his sword at that very second. Soho noticed this attack and managed to bounce aside in time. They continued to fight with all their might and the destruction was terrifying. In fact, all the stones started flying in different directions from these blows, and eventually our hero was able to reach the strength that the boss of this dungeon possessed. Although he attacked with all his might, he realized that it was still not enough for him, he needed to become even faster. But suddenly the dungeon boss struck him with his sword, but he dryly blocked it in time. However, the blow was so strong that he flew off to the side. At that same second, he decided to counterattack. Such was the young lord's strength, although he hadn't even used it to its full power. But after gaining a level, it at least felt like a battle. The Black Knight was stronger than he had anticipated, his characteristics are no match for ordinary soldiers. In other words, he is an exception. But since he's an exception, the same can be said for him. He might not be aware of all the rules of the game, but his stats were improved at level 1, so he could easily defeat high-level soldiers. If you recall, each characteristic increased by 1 as you leveled up, and the current characteristic along with bonuses corresponds to level 110 rather than level 70. Their battle lasted for a long time. In the end, with the help of Dry was still able to break through the defense of this dungeon boss. With a very strong punch, he broke through the wall that was in this room. As soon as they fell to the ground, the dungeon boss realized that there was incredible potential hidden in this boy. He didn't stop attacking him, and the explosions from the blows were so strong that all the pillars and the entire building started to collapse. They continued to fight, but managed to still adjust to his opponent. Attacking him countless times, he began to move even faster. At one point, he noticed a portal suddenly open behind him. He realized that it was most likely an exit, and determinedly began to move in its direction. But as soon as he stepped out of the portal, he saw a large building and realized it was an area of his city. But that building was burning, and he didn't understand why. Suddenly he saw a three-headed monster in front of him looking at him, and without thinking long, that monster started attacking him. But suddenly the monster stopped, for he was racked with fear of that boy, and dryly considered that it was not a monster. For it looked like a living statue. And suddenly he began to approach another door. As soon as he opened it, he saw a long corridor, and following the corridor was a huge city that burned with eternal fire, and the monsters that came out of that fire. Soon he encountered all of them, trying to overpower them. And when he got to the 10th floor, up to the 20th floor, and up to the 30th floor, he defeated them all. On each of the 10 floors, he killed all the monsters that came in his way. But he wondered why they were all so weak. On the 50th floor, he met a boss who died in just a couple of hits. To him, this battle seemed rather boring. He started to think that he might have overdone his level up for the battle with the Black Man. But as he continued walking through the city that was all on fire, he realized that it was definitely possible to mop up 1 floor per hour. And soon, after the 87th floor, he defeated all the monsters and was able to reach the 100th floor. He thought that nothing unusual would happen anymore, but as soon as he came out of the portal, a girl appeared in front of him. But he didn't hesitate, because his time was precious to him, and decided to attack this girl quickly. She started shouting for him to wait, and started saying that even the overlords could easily get here. Who would have thought that a young overlord would be able to reach here on his own in just a few tries? After all, he couldn't make it this far last time. But Dryly didn't understand what she was talking about or what even happened last time, and she began to say that she was the eldest daughter of the demon, the first guarantor of the clan for the sake of it. And she greeted Dryly at the final step. He decided to ask what it all meant, but he didn't understand anything further. But the girl replied that everything was over for them, and there used to be a stage called Demon King, but had to take it when their plan became the first. And, first of all, they wanted to congratulate the young lord and offered him a banquet with his father, because he had prepared a grand celebration. But dryly he began to ask her what she had said, and she pointed her finger at the gate, and asked what it was, and she replied that it was a state gate leading to another dimension, not to the castle of the Demon King. He realized that these things were called gates and decided to leave, because he didn't know what demons ate. But he was still young for such a thing and suggested that they have a banquet in a few years. But the girl was angry, for she remembered that the overlord had told her that they would meet, and it had been 60 years since the demon castle had been abandoned, and they had only turned to them to create a sculpture. And she couldn't leave it at that, but dryly told her that she had introduced herself as Easel of the Raider clan, and he would remember that, and they would definitely meet again. This girl was so embarrassed that she waved back at him and said, "See you later." But as soon as Dry walked into the gate, he started thinking about I too, after all, the real way out, or is it a trap? And as soon as he stepped out of the gate, he realized that this was not the end, for in front of him he met many terrible ants that were waiting for him. Did he start fighting them? Well, of course he started running away from them, for he didn't realize what kind of rabid ants they were. There was no end to them yet. Realized that thanks to them, his level continued to steadily increase. And when he was already used to these monsters, he realized that he had to start moving towards the place where the huge door was. As soon as he entered it, he saw a huge room and began to wonder, what size is the owner of this place? Since it's this big. And as soon as he turned around, he saw the only ant in the room. He wondered why he was crying, and immediately they began to fight. They fought with amazing speed and strength, but the ant was still superior in strength, and he managed to hit him hard several times. But the ant didn't want to just give up and started attacking back, but as soon as he got close, Dry hitting him a few more times. The ant realized that he needed to retreat and heal his wounds. But after he was able to heal his wounds and began to counterattack, Dry also didn't want to stop and continue to beat him up. Seeing the tears on Ant's face, he didn't understand what was wrong with him. After a few blows, the ant bounced off and started saying that he was careless, and at one point fell to the ground and stopped moving. It was a relief for Dry, because he was so lucky that this winged ant was rather creepy, but it stayed open the whole time and didn't attack him much, pausing between movements. Despite that, he almost managed to overpower it, but suddenly he saw another gate and before he went inside, he realized that he couldn't keep leveling up and he should be able to get home now. But as soon as he stepped out of the portal, he saw the terrifying dragons and giants that had already met him at his brother's exit. It was one problem after another, and he was still at level 99. After numerous battles with those and the giants as well as the horrible monsters that came his way, he had destroyed and smashed all the defenses that those monsters had. Even though they were much bigger and had much more strength, still he was stronger and was able to overpower them. It was only the first round, and following the first squad was the second squad, and Dry didn't stop. And once he had destroyed them, there were others, higher orcs, that flew on dragons. He looked at all of them and didn't understand where they were coming from or why they wanted to fight him in the sky. So, at one point, he was able to catch one of the orcs that was flying at him on a dragon. As soon as he destroyed it, he started jumping under the dragons that were flying above him and destroying everyone in his path. Suddenly he met large earth giants in front of him, and on one of the giants stood some creature that began to say that it had been 30 years since he had joined the army of the possession of eternal rest. Only marshals could participate in this game, but since he was allowed to participate, it meant that he had won his lord's favor as an excellent warrior. Young lord, did he really think he could handle him if he fought at full strength? But after he dryly heard some squeaking, he sent that monster that was talking to him to another world. Soho thought it was over, but suddenly some force started to press him down to the earth. He realized that someone was trying to crush him with a monstrous force, and as soon as he raised his head, he saw the monster above him and realized what it was doing, and he wondered if the Black Knight and the Black Ant were taking the form of a shadow. He began to guess that he had already become like the voice and enemies in a convenient form become floor bosses or in the ground all covered in rocks. He realized that as long as he could kill the bastard, he could fight. But suddenly he saw 3 very large shadow dragons flying towards him, and from their Morga vampire aura began to appear, and he realized his mistake. There were 3 more shadow monsters that wanted to finish him off. As soon as they started releasing their flames that covered all the dry ground, he managed to run aside and jumped under the dragons and started beating them up. He continued to beat them with incredible speed and incredible strength. In the end, he was able to straighten out those 3 dragons. As soon as he dry hopped on one of the dragons and hit the orc that was sitting on it, constantly being on the dragon, he saw the orc that was the boss and realized that he looked the most annoying. He decided to start with him. But that orc started using his staff and thus summoned a huge red ball that started flying towards him. However, he was able to dodge it. And as soon as he turned around, he saw someone big orb blow up the mountain behind him. The orc began to look closely and realized what had happened in a way he hadn't thought possible. After all, thanks to his new staff, he was now much cooler. After that, he started fighting the rest of the orcs that came his way. He was able to deal with the stone giants as well. But suddenly, he saw many more shadow dragons and large soldiers starting to charge towards him. One of them started to say that the young overlord, indeed, he thought he could overpower him like that. But no sooner had he finished speaking than Soho hit him once more. And this time, he was already pretty sure he had finished him off. And the next monster that appeared started saying that he was able to get this far because of his secret service in his lord's army. And even if he has forgotten, he wants to impress his lord and show his loyalty. But his story didn't last long, for immediately they attacked and defeated him. At this point, he realized that he couldn't hold on much longer if they kept showing up endlessly. And he decided that he needed to master his power a little more and be more careful, avoiding unnecessary movements until he could fight against the whole army alone. After all, everything depended on his hands alone. And all the dragons that were in his path started to die at that very second. That orc, who was standing nearby and was the strongest, started to use a barrier shield to defend himself from the enemy force that was attacking him. In that same second, someone appeared behind his back and started telling him, "If I just disappear, you will be disappointed and you should show me something worthy or I will disappear." And once he was able to destroy all the opponents that were in his way, he realized that his characteristics hadn't improved. After how many battles had he gotten better at controlling his strength? Well, his rest wasn't long, and other creatures began to appear. One of them started to descend from the sky. Dry looked at it and realized that it was strong, and at least stronger than the ant he had just fought. He turned to the shadow soldier, assuming he could probably talk too, and Dry decided to ask him something before the battle. He asked what percentage of the total number of troops he was fighting, and the Baryon began to say that, excluding the inhabitants of the demon castle, there was about 1 unit of 3,000. Soho realized that he had defeated that many demons, but it was only a small fraction. Sukhov sighed and decided that he was going to start fighting at full strength right now, but the Baryon that started walking towards him started telling him, Lord, that he had become incredibly strong. But Sukhov didn't understand why they kept calling him young lord, and if it had anything to do with how he came to this world. Well, okay, lord, but why add the word young? As soon as they started fighting, Soho saw real strength. This monster was definitely superior to all the monsters he had fought, and in an instant, it was able to wound him. Soho realized that he could turn his sword into a whip. Although it is a versatile weapon, but once it is caught, it becomes useless in the hands of the enemy. And in that same second, Dry decided to attack back. And as soon as he hit, all the air from the attack started to lift all the rocks from the ground. As the Baryon blocked his attack, Dry realized that if he defends himself with both hands at once, he becomes open. And in that very second, he hit him with all his might, causing the Baryon to start flying off. And as soon as the dust settled, he dryly began telling the shadow soldier that he was sure he couldn't beat him at this rate, and if they continued, it would take all night. And he is, after all, not afraid of this floor. He's just a decoy, after all. And as soon as Dry raised his head, he saw the boss of this dungeon in the sky, who began to jump out of the dragon and fly towards him. And as soon as he flew to the ground from the impact, everything started flying in different directions. But, dryly, he was already ready for battle, and he realized that this guy who came down was the master of this place. He started to see his daggers start to appear, and he was fighting a human for the first time. He wondered if he could talk to him, but as soon as he said hello he heard nothing in response. There was only silence, and suddenly all was pierced by the realization that a portal had appeared. But he didn't understand why it was where it appeared. After all, he hadn't defeated the boss yet. But he suddenly realized that it meant that maybe this was the final battle, and he just needed to defeat this man to return home. In an instant, he began to build up his strength to move from his spot. And just as he reached that guy, they met with blows. They began to fight at full force, and Soho began to press his opponent, thus attacking him more times in a few seconds. They kept hitting each other, but at one point their punch was so strong that the air currents flying around began to cut everything in their path, and one of these currents caught Soho's face. And in the next moment, Soho bounced to the side and began to realize that his opponent was quite fast and, at the same time, very strong. And it was astonishing. Not only does he possess immense power, but also all of his attacks are flawless. Each blow was the result of long training, and he wondered how much his opponent had worked on it and how many times he had died to achieve such skill. But Dry still didn't intend to just give up. After all, his characteristics had reached their limit, and his combat skills had developed to the point where he could completely master his strength even if he was superior in every way. Soho began to see Putin as he was closing in on victory. And just as he decided to deliver the final blow, his glove began to crumble, his hands shook, and he realized that he was facing a superior opponent who was the final boss. But he still had one more hand left, and he hoped he could win. And as soon as he swung, Jinwoo took his head and began to speak. "Did you enjoy this game?" After all, it turned out to be quite an impressive truth. Suddenly, Soho noticed that his father, Jinwoo, was standing in front of him, and he started pushing the door Dry and saying that his time wasn't up yet. Not in the same second Dry started waking up and he realized that he was in his classroom. He realized it was some kind of weird dream, most likely because he was playing a lot. First getting lost in a weird dungeon and then also his father as a boss. Suddenly a girl started walking into the classroom and asking him why he was still here and if he was going to go home, because she had to close the classroom. And at this time, Jinwoo was on the roof of the school, and he began to think about the architect's power being left in his domain of eternal peace. It turns out that it is possible to use the iris that stood behind him in such a useful way. He began to tell his lord if he should give his powers back to the young lord. After all, they had done this kind of test many times, but this was the first time he had gotten this far, and he was beginning to think that he had done a decent job. But Jinwoo began to answer him that could they have defeated the Dragon Emperor if he had only believed in his own strength. And immediately he rushed into battle. And no matter how strong a man is, he should be able to let go if there is no guarantee of victory. It is reckless to challenge an enemy that is superior in strength, and too reckless, and he is not ready yet. But one day he will learn to wield his power wisely depending on the situation. But even if he doesn't learn anything in the end, this kid will open the door again and again for you to challenge him. And Jinwoo started telling his shadow soldiers, looking at the drawing, that he still had a couple things left to do, and why don't he judge the family for dinner somewhere later? A little while later, the news began to show that the scamming brothers who had caused an uproar in the country, Hwang Dong-suk and Hwang Dong-soo, had been arrested today, and were currently reporting live from the scene. Further up in the mountains, a large fire was observed, which quickly spread to a residential neighborhood nearby. However, firefighters managed to contain and extinguish the fires, involving 52 fire engines and 800 firefighters. At this time, one of the firefighters approached another firefighter and found him putting cold water on his head and started saying that they did a great job today. But that man, who looked like his captain, saw that even after the work he had done, he still had a lot of energy left, and he decided that one day he was going to be just like his captain. The next day, Jinho, who was the chairman of the company, started walking down the hallway with his underlings. One of them started telling him that they needed to come up with a name for a new VR game from their company. But Jinho didn't listen to him, and as soon as he opened the door, he started shouting to the entire staff that his wife was 6 weeks pregnant, and everyone started congratulating him. The supervisor yelled that finally their chairman was going to be a father. As he sat down in his chair, he announced that the name of their new game would be Wonderful World, as it was perfect for a game that would immerse the player in virtual reality. However, the staff started to resent and protest against this title as they thought it was unfortunate and scary to promote the game. But Jinho asked his staff not to worry as he has already convinced one of the investors to help them and they will have no problem with money. I'm this investor, one of the most influential people in the gaming industry, and I invested in their game. As I was sitting there reading about his grandson, I started asking the guy sitting near me if there was anything else being written about his precious grandson. I was curious to see what he had accomplished. Turns out he turned down an offered position and decided to open a game studio instead. However, at the same time, a huge gate began to appear over the big city. And there were those gates, and no one knew what was behind them. So people were constantly afraid of them and prayed that they would never open. But there were those who had this fear of the gate, and such people were called hunters. And so the phone rang, and a man began to say that this was the Hunters Association help desk. They started shouting into the phone that he had already asked them repeatedly not to send Mr. Song, but they wouldn't listen to him. And the Hunter Association guy started saying that he was sorry and there must have been a mistake in forming the attack team. He would ask for a detailed description of the nature of the problem, and that hunter started shouting again into the tube that in detail the description of his reluctance to drag the corpse would go nowhere. They will order to do, ostensibly to the hunters, who will instantly break away from any rustle. If the composition of the team doesn't change, he'll be the one to leave. And for the sake of interest, he asks any student he meets, What did he want to be? And there are only 3 possible answers. A famous hunter, an employee of a large guild, and an employee of a hunters association, and one of the employees of the hunters association thought that all hunters had a level playing field. But it turned out that there were a lot of requests where each hunter wanted something different. At this moment, the dispatcher started typing on the keyboard and remembered what that hunter's name was, and suddenly he remembered that his name was Jin Woo, and he was the weakest ranked hunter. With the worst mana reserve and paranogu, he differed from an ordinary human with only slightly better characteristics. And the dispatcher didn't understand, looking at the monitor, how he had so many injuries, and it was a miracle he was still alive. He wondered why he didn't stop trying to become a hunter, and if there was some unusual reason. But suddenly he saw that his mother had gotten over her perpetual sleeping sickness, and his younger sister was going to middle school. And he realized that apparently he was just forced to live like that. A little later, he started to approach his chief and say that he didn't think they should continue to partner with Hunter Jinwoo as a hunter. But the chief replied that they had already tried and it didn't work out, and started asking the dispatcher why he joined the Hunter Association. And he replied that because of the news he saw when he was a kid, they showed a TV program about hunters taking over inside the gate where the hunters were trying to rescue their comrades. And he was curious at first. And rescuing his comrades had injured him more, but who would save him? He wanted to be the one who could help them, and he did his best to make sure the hunters didn't suffer or die. That was roughly what he had thought at the time. And at this point, the chief asked the dispatcher if he wanted to fire Jinwoo or help him. To which the dispatcher began to say that he was right and, remembering the past, he could do nothing but advise him to quit. But suddenly Chief started giving him papers and said that if there was another way to solve the problem, some high-ranking awakened ones refused to work with the hunters, because they were not interested in money. So the chief suggested, why not convince these hunters to help the rest of us? When the dispatcher saw a hunter healer who was a high-ranked healer and refused to work as a hunter because of fear, Jinwoo overcame his fear and entered the gate despite his weak characteristics. And if fear can be gotten rid of, the lack of it will become the strength of the weak. He hopes that he can help with traveling beyond the gate at least a little bit. A little later, as the sun began to set over the horizon, Soho went with his girlfriend from school and they began to play rock, scissors, paper. As soon as he lost, she started telling him that he was not at all good at such games and he would have to carry her in his bag as a loss. But suddenly Soho turned his head, for he thought he had noticed something, that something had flown over him. But still he realized that he had imagined it. And at that time a big dragon was flying over the city so high that Pasha couldn't see it. And on the dragon stood Jinwoo and his wife. And she, looking at this view, began to tell him that the last time they had admired this view, it had been a long time. But Jinwoo asked her to turn around, and as soon as she turned her head, he showed her his gift. It was in honor of their 16th wedding anniversary. She told him to go home first, to which Jinwoo kissed her and said he would be as soon as possible if she waited for him. And so, just as his wife began to fly away on the dragon Jinwoo, he hovered in the air in front of the huge gate and began to remember what he had been told. A man with immense power acts like a magnet that attracts creepy creatures from other worlds. And in that very second, he began to summon his shadow soldiers that began to appear behind him. He began to remember what was beyond the gate, and he was scared. What if monsters much stronger than the ones he had already dealt with appeared? Who would die? He won't know until he opens the gate. Even if he doesn't know he has his son waiting for him, who was in the very same place when he passed the test and when he died again. And he can't remember which time he's been dying here, and it was hard and he wanted to go home. But when he only had one shot left, he couldn't stop hearing that voice that told him to rise up. And even if it's his last try, and if he doesn't want to be stuck here forever, if he can overcome this and wants to challenge what's on the other side of the barrier.